Hey everyone, and welcome back to Stories for Sleep. I know a lot of you listen to these stories to help you relax and drift off to sleep. But before you close your eyes, I have a little favour to ask. If you can, leave a comment and let me know where you're listening from. It's always fun to see how many places around the world we're connecting with. And if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to hit like and subscribe so you never miss a new one. Now, it's time to get comfy and relax. Let's forget about everything for a moment and enjoy tonight's story together. Ready? Let's begin.
There was something about that house. No, not about it, but within it. It wasn't just the way it looked, though its peeling paint and crooked sagging frame suggested years of neglect. Nor was it the silent, oppressive air that clung to the place like a fog, refusing to lift even in the brightest daylight. It wasn't the location either, perched at the very end of a street where no one seemed to wander, a cul-de-sac that always felt a little too quiet, a little too still. No, it was the feeling the house gave you, the subtle, instinctual pull in your gut that told you this place was never meant to be inhabited, not by anyone. But none of that mattered to the Hendersons. It was a fresh start, a new chapter. They had their reasons, like everyone does, reasons they didn't discuss openly, but which were clear in the sharp lines of their faces, the guarded expressions in their eyes. They had fled, in a sense, from something, from the ghosts of the past, from broken dreams. The house at the end of the street wasn't much, not on the outside. A tired two-story structure with windows that appeared to sag under their own weight, and a porch that creaked like it had something to say if you stood on it long enough. The yard was overgrown, choked with tall grass and creeping ivy, and the trees in the backyard seemed older than time itself, their branches twisted in unnatural shapes, as though they were trying to escape their roots. But the price was right, and the house, despite its deep-set, almost malevolent aura, had potential, or so they thought. They hadn't planned to live here forever, but for now it was enough. He, the father, who had once been a hopeful man, but now only seemed to exude a sense of defeat in the way he carried himself, had thought the house might offer solace, or at least the chance to pretend that things could be normal again. She, his wife, silent and brooding, had come to the house for different reasons. She didn't believe in second chances, not anymore, but this house had its allure. She wasn't sure what it was, but there was something here that made her feel known. It unsettled her. Their daughter, too young to fully understand why they had moved so suddenly, accepted it all with the wide-eyed acceptance of youth. But she felt it too, that strange weight in the air, and she didn't know why she kept hearing whispers from the rooms that were always too dark to enter. The first night in the house felt wrong, but they pushed it away. They hadn't spent the last few months looking for a home, only to abandon this one on a whim. It was theirs now, and it would become whatever they chose it to be. But that night, the first of many, they would learn the truth. After the truck was unloaded and the moving boxes stacked in corners, Greg and Caroline sat in the kitchen, the only room in the house with any semblance of warmth, while their daughter, Rachel, played with the few toys she had brought. The kitchen was small, with the smell of wood and dust in the air, but it had character, potential. Caroline liked the tile floor, and Greg thought it was a nice enough space to cook in. The only thing that bothered them was the feeling in the air. It was an empty sort of feeling, as though the house itself were waiting for something, as though it had been waiting for them. "You're sure you're okay with this?" Greg asked, looking over at Caroline as she sipped her tea. Her eyes were fixed on something out the window, but he knew better than to question her gaze. She always stared like that when she was lost in thought. "I'm fine," she said, but there was something about her tone, something hollow, that he didn't trust. She had said that every time they had moved, and he always wanted to believe her. But this time, there was a weight behind her words that felt different. It wasn't just the exhaustion from the move. No, it was more than that. And when he looked at her, he saw it. The same fear that had been gnawing at him all day. "I'll start unpacking the living room in a bit. You should get some rest." Caroline nodded, but she didn't move. Instead, she glanced at the back door. It was slightly ajar, and for a moment it seemed as though it had moved on its own. She shivered, but Greg didn't notice. His mind was elsewhere, too consumed by the tiredness creeping into his bones. Rachel's laughter broke the silence, and Caroline's head snapped around. The child was playing with a ball, rolling it across the floor, but there was something unsettling about her movements. The way she crawled after the ball, a little too quickly, almost unnaturally so, her hands splayed out like she was searching for something in the shadows. Caroline blinked, and in that instant she saw something. A flicker, maybe, a shadow darting past the doorway. But when she turned her head to look, the hallway was empty, just the old sagging wallpaper peeling at the edges. "What is it?" Greg asked, sensing her discomfort. Caroline took a deep breath. "I don't know. I just thought I saw. Never mind. Maybe I'm just tired." Greg didn't argue. He understood too well what it meant to feel like you were being watched by something that didn't quite belong. That night, as they settled into bed, the house seemed to shift around them. The floorboards creaked and groaned, not like an old house settling, but like something heavier, something more deliberate. The wind outside began to pick up, rattling the windows, but there was no rain. It felt, instead, like something was breathing outside. Caroline lay awake long after Greg had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse, stretching toward her like hungry fingers. She pulled the covers higher, trying to block them out, but it didn't help. The air felt thick, stifling. She needed to get up, needed to do something to shake the growing sense of dread, but the thought of stepping out of bed into the cold, empty hallway, it was too much. She closed her eyes and listened. At first it was just the creaking of the house, the sounds of wind against the windows, but then there was a soft whispering, almost like voices, but too quiet to make out. It was coming from downstairs. She held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Was Greg awake? Had he heard it too? But when she turned to look at him, his eyes were closed, his breathing slow and steady. Caroline sat up in bed, slowly, carefully, her feet brushing the cold floor. She didn't dare make a sound as she slipped out from under the covers, stepping lightly toward the door. The whispering grew louder, closer. She didn't know what it was, or what it wanted, but she knew it wasn't the wind. The house wasn't empty, not by a long shot. As she reached the door to the hallway, a soft, fleeting thought crossed her mind. What if I shouldn't open this door? But the thought was gone as quickly as it had come. She grasped the knob, turning it with a soft click. The door opened into the pitch-black hallway. The air was thick with the scent of dust and mildew, and the oppressive silence hung over her like a weight. The whispering seemed to come from everywhere, all at once. In that moment, Caroline understood something she hadn't before. This house was no ordinary home. It was a place where something dark had once lived, and perhaps still did. With her breath caught in her throat, she stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath her feet. The darkness ahead swallowed her whole. Caroline's breath caught in her throat as she stepped into the hallway. The floorboards creaked underfoot, old wood groaning in protest, but it was the whispers that unsettled her most. They seemed to crawl up her spine, a hissing chorus of voices too low to understand, but too desperate to ignore. The darkness ahead was impenetrable, a thick blackness that swallowed every inch of the hallway, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She glanced back at the bedroom door, the dim light from the window spilling into the hallway, casting long shadows that reached toward her like fingers from some ancient nightmare. It felt wrong. It looked wrong. But her feet carried her forward anyway, propelled by a strange force she couldn't explain. It was as if something inside her, something she didn't want to acknowledge, was urging her to press on. The whispers grew louder, closer. Get out. Get out. Caroline stopped, her heart thumping in her chest. She knew she should turn around. Go back to the bed, to the warmth of Greg's steady breathing, to the false comfort of normalcy. But something made her linger. Her eyes flicked nervously toward the staircase, which seemed to loom at the end of the hallway like a dark mouth waiting to swallow her. There was something up there, she could feel it, a presence lurking just beyond her reach. She moved, one foot dragging after the other, each step slower than the last, her pulse racing as the voices danced around her ears, the whispers now a dull roar in her skull. Come closer. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like an invitation, one that wrapped itself around her like smoke, slithering into her thoughts. Her body was stiff, frozen, but her mind was alive with fear. She didn't understand why she couldn't turn back, why she had to keep moving forward. The hallway stretched on, an endless corridor of decay. The wallpaper peeled away in strips, revealing the mottled wood beneath, and the paint on the baseboards had chipped away long ago. There was no life here, no sign of anyone having lived here in years, if not decades. The house felt older than it had any right to be, and it felt aware of her, watching, waiting. Caroline reached the base of the stairs. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. Come, come, come. She placed a trembling hand on the banister, feeling the cold wood beneath her fingers. Her breath was shallow now, a thin trickle of air that barely filled her lungs. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the very house itself was trying to pull her back, to drag her down into the depths of whatever nightmare it had once housed. The walls felt alive, pulsating in rhythm with her heartbeat, vibrating with something ancient and cruel. Caroline's eyes scanned the dark staircase. The shadows seemed to shift as if alive, as if something were lurking just out of sight, something that wanted her to come closer. The whispers were nearly deafening now, the words indistinct but unmistakable in their urgency. You have to see. She felt it then, like a hand, cold and clammy, brushing against her mind. Something in the house, something tied to the house itself, was reaching out to her, pulling her in. Her breath hitched as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She felt trapped, caught in a web of invisible threads, pulled into a place she didn't want to be, didn't belong. Something wasn't right. The house wasn't just old. It was wrong. Greg, she whispered, though the word felt small and inadequate, as if it had been lost in the suffocating silence that pressed in around her. But no answer came, not from behind her, not from anywhere. Her fingers clenched around the banister, and for a moment she was sure she felt it, something, moving under the floorboards beneath her feet. The house groaned, a low, menacing sound, as though the very foundation was shifting, settling into place after centuries of waiting. Downstairs, come to us. A sickening chill ran down Caroline's spine. The voice was clearer now, though still not fully intelligible. It was a chorus, many voices layered on top of each other, whispering the same thing over and over. She had to leave. She knew that now. She had to get back to Greg. She had to. But before she could move, there was a sharp crack behind her, the unmistakable sound of something breaking. She spun around, heart hammering in her chest. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood a figure, a shadow. No, not a shadow. A shape, tall and thin, so still it could have been a part of the wall itself. Her breath froze in her throat, and for a second she couldn't move, couldn't blink. It wasn't Greg. It wasn't human. The shape was dark, almost liquid in the way it seemed to warp the air around it, distorting its edges. Its form shifted unnaturally, like smoke caught in a wind, twisting and flickering in the corners of her vision. But it wasn't just the figure that paralyzed her. It was the eyes. Eyes that weren't eyes at all, but empty hollows, filled with an abyss so deep it seemed to swallow the very light of the hallway. Her mind screamed for her to run, to do anything, but her body betrayed her. The figure took a step forward. Caroline couldn't breathe. Her feet were frozen to the floor. She couldn't make herself move, couldn't bring herself to look away from the eyes that seemed to see into her very soul, piercing through the veil of her fear and doubt. The shadow was closer now, moving toward her in that unnatural gliding way. The floorboards beneath it didn't creak. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. It was just the house, just the night playing tricks on her mind. But the whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices that rose to a maddening crescendo, deafening in its intensity. Come, come to us. And then, just like that, the figure was gone. The hallway was empty again, save for the flickering light of the hallway lamp that cast long shadows against the walls. Caroline blinked, her heart pounding in her chest. Her knees felt weak, and for a moment she thought she might collapse right there on the floor. The figure had disappeared, leaving nothing behind but the oppressive silence of the house. Her mind raced as she stumbled backward, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Had it all been a figment of her imagination? But then, just as quickly as the figure had appeared, she heard it, a low, guttural whisper seeping from the floor beneath her feet. It's not over. It's only just begun. Caroline's blood turned to ice, and without another thought, she turned and fled back toward the bedroom, her feet pounding on the floor, the echo of her frantic footsteps deafening in the silence. As she reached the door, she slammed it open and rushed inside, finding Greg still asleep in their bed, undisturbed by her frantic movement. But she wasn't so sure anymore. She wasn't sure if Greg was ever going to be enough to keep the shadows at bay. Not in this house. The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the narrow halls. Caroline stood there, heart racing, eyes wild as she tried to catch her breath. She glanced back at the bedroom, the safe, quiet room where her husband lay asleep, blissfully unaware of the terror she had just witnessed. The figure, the shadow, the whispers. It all felt too real, too present, as if the house itself had taken on a life of its own, and she was just a pawn in some cruel game. Her pulse hammered in her throat as she stumbled back to the bed, falling to her knees beside it. Greg still lay there, his breathing deep and even, completely unaware of the nightmare she had just faced. She wanted to shake him awake, to scream in his face, to make him see, make him understand. But part of her knew it wouldn't matter. The house had a way of distorting reality, of turning even the most logical thoughts into madness. Greg. Her voice cracked as she spoke his name, but he didn't stir. For a long moment, she simply sat there, her hand gripping the edge of the mattress as though it might be the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. She looked at him again, at the peaceful, ordinary man she had married. But tonight, there was something about him that seemed distant, as if the space between them had somehow grown wider, as if the house had already begun to tear at the threads that bound them together. The room was silent now, too silent. There were no more whispers, no more scratching from within the walls, no more movement from the shadows. It was as though the house itself had decided to wait, biding its time before it would strike again. And strike it would. Caroline knew that. Deep down, she knew the house had not finished with her yet. There was more to come. She reached out and touched Greg's arm, hoping to reassure herself, to convince herself that nothing was wrong. But the moment her fingers brushed against his skin, she felt a sudden, unexplainable jolt of cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that came with a draft or a chill in the air. No, this was something deeper, something more unnatural. It radiated from his skin like a wave of ice, crawling up her arm, spreading into her chest, settling in the pit of her stomach. Greg didn't move. Her heart pounded harder now, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She pulled her hand back, her mind racing with panic. This wasn't right. None of it was right. She had to leave, had to get out of that house before it consumed them all. But then she heard it, the soft, slow creak of the floorboards outside their room. Caroline's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't just the house settling. This sound was too deliberate, too purposeful. The footsteps were too slow, too intentional. Someone or something was out there. She stood up quickly, her legs unsteady beneath her, as she moved toward the door. It felt like an eternity as she reached for the knob, her fingers trembling. The house was holding its breath again, and she could feel the weight of whatever lurked just beyond the threshold, waiting for her. The door swung open with a soft creak, and she stepped out into the hallway, her eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The whispers had returned, quieter now, like a distant murmur, but they were still there, just beneath the surface, tugging at her mind. The air in the hallway felt wrong, stale, heavy. It was as if the very space around her had been infected, as though the house itself were slowly suffocating. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving in the shadows, something that wasn't quite human. A cold draft blew past her, and she shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. It was coming from the stairs again, that same pull, that same whispering that beckoned her toward the dark depths below. Without thinking, Caroline turned toward the staircase. Her feet moved of their own accord, leading her to the top of the stairs. She hesitated, but only for a moment. The darkness below seemed to draw her in like an unseen hand pulling at the very core of her being. She felt nauseous, her head spinning, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to go down there, She had to see what was waiting. The staircase was steep, narrow, the old wood groaning beneath her weight. As she descended, her mind screamed for her to stop, to turn around and run back upstairs. But there was no turning back now. There never was. The whispering grew louder, clearer now, and as Caroline reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw it. A door, half open, just enough to let the faintest sliver of light spill out from the crack. It was a door she hadn't noticed before, not in all her time in the house. She had been in the basement once, but it had been locked. She hadn't thought twice about it at the time, but now there was no mistaking it. The door was calling to her. "Come in," the voices whispered in unison. Come see what we've hidden." Caroline's pulse raced as she stepped forward, every instinct in her body screaming for her to turn around. But her feet were glued to the floor, and the door seemed to open of its own accord, the hinges creaking in a way that made her bones ache. The room beyond was dark, cold, and when Caroline stepped inside, she felt the air thicken around her. It was as though she had just crossed some invisible threshold, stepping into a space that didn't belong in the world. The darkness was alive in here, pressing in from all sides, as if the shadows themselves were closing in on her, eager to pull her deeper. The room was bare, save for a single object, a large rectangular shape draped in a tattered sheet. The moment she saw it, Caroline knew. She knew without a doubt what was beneath the cloth. The whispers were deafening now, the voices blending together in a cacophony of desperation, of pleading. "Come closer. See what we've kept from you." Her hand moved on its own, drawn toward the shape. She reached out, and as her fingers brushed the edge of the sheet, a chill shot up her spine, and the whispers stopped, suddenly, as if the house itself had held its breath. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, slowly, Caroline pulled back the sheet. The first thing she saw were the eyes that had been sewn shut with thick, crude stitches. The body beneath the sheet was that of a man, or had once been. Now it was a grotesque, misshapen thing, its skin pale and mottled, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. There were symbols carved into its flesh, symbols that seemed to move, writhing and shifting in the dim light. And the eyes, the stitched-up eyes, they were alive. And as Caroline stared into them, she understood in an instant what the house had been hiding. The truth of the darkness that had been buried here, the thing that had been waiting, the thing that had never left. The eyes were the worst part. Caroline didn't know how long she stood there, her fingers trembling as they still hovered above the ruined, stitched-up face. The dark, mottled skin looked like it had been burned, flayed open, and then patched back together, if that was even the right word for what had been done to it. But it was the eyes that held her, not the sheer grotesqueness of the body, not the unnatural way the limbs twisted beneath the sheet. No, it was the eyes, those raw, twitching, pulsing things, as if they were trying to escape their confines. She could see them, feel them, locked behind the stitches, the unease, the desperate, clawing desire to be free. Caroline's breath caught in her throat as her mind screamed at her to look away, to turn and run as fast as she could. Her body wanted to, her legs begging for release, for movement, but she couldn't move, couldn't leave. There was something about this place, something about the eyes, something that held her there. The whispering was gone. The room was still now, so painfully silent that she could hear the soft thud of her own heart in her ears. But the silence didn't comfort her. It only made the feeling worse, more suffocating. Something was coming. Something was waiting, just out of sight, and the house was drawing tighter around her, closing in with every second. She stumbled back a step, her fingers still tracing the air above the body, and her stomach turned as she pulled her gaze from the thing beneath the sheet. Do not look at it again. Do not look again. But it was too late. Her eyes, unwillingly, were drawn back to the face beneath the cloth. The eyes were still there, alive in a way that no human eyes should be. They blinked slowly, the raw stitches pulling apart slightly with each movement, like they were going to tear wide open. Caroline's throat tightened. She swallowed, but the lump in her throat wouldn't go away. The whispers returned, soft and mournful at first, then growing louder, a cacophony of voices layered over each other, all pleading, all begging her to understand. It's not him. It never was. Caroline's pulse quickened. She knew what they meant. The thing beneath the cloth, the thing with the eyes, whatever it wasn't human. It was something else, something old, something twisted. And it wasn't the only thing that had been buried here. The shadows in the room began to shift, as if they were alive. They crawled along the walls, stretching and reaching, pulling closer, pressing in on her. Caroline backed up again, her feet dragging across the floor, but her body was heavy now. The air itself was thick, dense, as though the house itself were trying to hold her in place. Suddenly, there was movement behind her, a sound, barely a whisper, but it was enough to snap her out of her paralysis. She spun around, gasping, her eyes wide. The basement was darker now, the shadows deeper. It was as if they were waiting for her to notice. Don't turn around. But she did. The eyes, still staring at her from beneath the cloth, still twitching, still living, beckoned her to look further into the room. Something more was hidden here, more than just the body. There had to be more. Her breath came in short gasps as she reached for the walls, steadying herself. She didn't know what was in the room with her, but she could feel it now, moving in the shadows, something ancient, something malevolent. The darkness wasn't just an absence of light anymore. It was something alive. Help us! The whisper came from the dark corner of the room, a faint, almost imperceptible murmur. Caroline froze, the hair on the back of her neck standing on end. Help us. Come to us. And then, like the shudder of a final breath, the thing beneath the cloth moved. Caroline gasped and stumbled backward, her legs finally giving way as she fell to her knees. The air was alive with sound now, rushing and shifting, the whispers growing louder, faster, like a crowd gathering, pulling her toward the thing on the floor. And then, as if she had been yanked from one place to another, she was there, in front of the body, her eyes locked with the living eyes that still twitched and blinked, those awful, desperate things that screamed without a sound. It's not him, the whispers said again, and this time Caroline understood. The body, the thing beneath the sheet, had been something else, something before, something that had been tied to the house in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. The eyes weren't human. They were something else. They were part of this, part of the house's long history, its legacy. It was then that Caroline realized something far more horrifying than the body itself. It wasn't just the house that had been feeding on fear. It had been feeding on something else too, tying itself to those who entered, those who stayed. The walls of the room felt as though they were closing in now, the shadows creeping toward her like fingers, curling around her thoughts. It was as if they wanted her to remember, wanted her to see something locked away beneath the house, beneath the history of the house. The whispers were louder now, sharper, as if they were coming from all sides. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The house had claimed her, just like it had claimed so many others before her. It was no longer enough for the house to simply haunt its occupants. It needed more. It needed them bound to it. The floor beneath her seemed to shift, the boards groaning and creaking like they were alive, pressing against her with the weight of history. And then, just as she thought her chest might burst from the pressure, she felt it. A cold hand on her shoulder. Caroline screamed. Greg's scream was distant at first, like it came from far off, maybe even from outside the house. But as she scrambled to her feet, her mind scrambled in a frenzy, her head spinning. He had to be awake. He had to be aware. He must feel it too. She stumbled toward the stairs, but it was too late. The darkness in the room thickened, and Caroline knew she was no longer alone. She wasn't just battling the house now. She was battling something much older, something deeper, something that had been waiting for her all along, and it would never let her go. Greg's scream echoed through the walls like a cracked bell, muffled by the weight of the house pressing down on everything. Caroline's feet slid across the cold basement floor, the air so thick it felt like she was wading through syrup. She could barely breathe, but the scream, it had jolted something inside her. The thing beneath the sheet, the living eyes, the darkness closing in on her. All of it came flooding back in an instant, flooding her thoughts with such intensity that she couldn't process them fast enough. She had to get to Greg, but every time she moved, every time she tried to push forward, it felt like something was holding her back. The shadows that had been growing so thick in the room behind her felt alive, restless, like they were alive now, crawling toward her, wanting her, needing her to stay in this place. The house had already claimed her body. She could feel it in her bones, deep in her marrow. It had marked her, twisted its fingers around her soul. But what about Greg? Was he still there? Was he still safe upstairs? Or had the house already taken him, too? Caroline didn't know. She couldn't think clearly. She had to get out. Her hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the stairs. Her head was spinning, dizziness threatening to drop her to her knees as the world around her seemed to shift and bend. But she couldn't stop. She couldn't let it claim him too. She couldn't let whatever that thing was, whatever had been waiting for her in the basement, drag him down into the depths as well. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her chest was tight. Her legs felt like lead, dragging beneath her. And then, there it was again, the sound of movement, the slow creak of the floorboards above her. She wasn't sure if it was Greg. She wasn't even sure if it was real, but it was enough to propel her forward. With every step, the house felt like it was breathing behind her, exhaling slowly, as if the walls themselves were alive, hungry for more. "Greg!" she gasped, stumbling onto the landing. She froze. The room at the top of the stairs was dark, but not empty. The shadows that had gathered earlier seemed to have thickened, like they were waiting for something, waiting for her. The whispers were faint again, but the air, the weight of it, was thick, pressing, clawing. She could feel it, feel the house tightening its grip around her chest, wrapping around her throat. "Come back." It was a whisper, faint, hollow, but familiar. "Greg!" Caroline cried again, stepping forward, her voice cracking. There, At the far end of the hallway, she saw him, standing in the dim light of the bedroom door. He was facing away from her, standing completely still. His figure was dark against the pale, flickering light, but there was something about it, something wrong. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't him. Caroline's chest constricted, the first tendrils of panic creeping in as she realized the truth. It was not Greg. The figure didn't move, but Caroline could feel it watching her. The house had twisted him, twisted Greg. It had drawn him in, just like it had with the others before them. She didn't know how, didn't understand why, but she knew one thing for sure. Whatever had been calling to her from the darkness, whatever had been hiding in the basement, was now fully awake. The shadows seemed to rise and writhe in the corners of her vision. They were alive, alive with the same twisted hunger, the same relentless need to claim her, to claim them both. "Greg!" Caroline's voice shattered the silence, her desperation rising like a storm. The figure didn't move, didn't react. Caroline's feet carried her forward before she could stop herself. She had to reach him. She had to drag him out of the house, away from whatever nightmare it had become. Her hand reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against his shoulder. She expected cold, expected the same sick, unnatural chill she'd felt earlier, but it wasn't cold. It was worse. The moment her fingers made contact with his skin, something sharp and hard surged through her, a jolt of electricity. No, not electricity. It felt more like a shock wave of pain, a violent, unforgiving force that rattled through her body, stealing the breath from her lungs. Caroline screamed, her body seizing under the weight of it. And then, as if in response, the figure slowly turned toward her. Greg's face, his face, was ashen, blank. His eyes were wide open, but they were empty, hollow, like there was nothing inside of him anymore. Nothing but darkness, nothing but the house. And when he opened his mouth, it wasn't his voice that came out. It was the same whispering chorus she had heard in the basement. "Come to us, come to us. There is no escape." Caroline stumbled back, her breath coming in frantic gasps. The shadows seemed to pulse now, throbbing, moving around her like waves in an ocean. She could feel the house closing in, the walls pushing toward her, suffocating her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head, her chest tight. This isn't you." But the figure in front of her just stood there, its head tilting slightly, as though it were waiting for her to understand, waiting for her to finally give in. Caroline could feel the house's weight pressing against her mind, its fingers pulling at the fragile threads of her thoughts. The walls seemed to close in tighter, until the air was too thick to breathe. The whispers were louder now, their voices blending together into a single, maddening roar. "It's too late. It's too late. It has always been too late." And then, as the house squeezed its final breath around her, the floor beneath her feet shifted. The wood groaned, splintered, cracking open like a wound in the earth. Caroline's eyes widened in horror as the floor opened beneath her, pulling her down, pulling her into the pit. The last thing she heard was Greg's voice again, no longer just a whisper, but loud, raw, and full of malice. "You can't escape." And then, nothing. It was a Friday night in early autumn when the wind turned colder than it had any right to be. Ben had noticed it first, the way the chill slipped through his jacket, the sudden bite of it that had nothing to do with the season. But that wasn't what had his thoughts spinning. No, it was the sound, The strange, hollow song that had begun drifting across the fields behind the old Graves estate. At first, he thought it was just the wind, the trees groaning under its weight, the kind of wind that made the world feel like it was bending at its edges. But no, this was different. It wasn't the wind at all. It was a song, a woman's voice, soft, mournful, rising and falling with an eerie, hypnotic quality. He'd heard it before, in dreams that felt too real, dreams of drowning, of endless dark, of being drawn into something that wanted him. Ben couldn't explain it. He couldn't tell anyone, not really. But that song, it gnawed at him, wormed into his mind like a worm in the ground, burrowing deeper with every passing second. At first, he thought he'd imagined it, that the strange sounds were just a trick of the night, nothing more than the sounds the woods made when they were left to their own devices. But then, Ben heard it again. He was sitting in his truck, parked on the side of the road, watching the house as the full moon climbed into the sky, casting long shadows across the dry grass. The song began as a whisper at first, then gathered strength, rolling through the night air like a tide, a woman's voice, and then it stopped. Ben's heart was thudding in his chest as he glanced toward the road ahead where the old Graves place lay. He knew the stories. Everyone knew the stories about that place, the one with the well out back, hidden beneath the brambles. Some said it was a death trap, a place where kids dared each other to throw rocks in just to hear the hollow plunk as they fell. Others said it was haunted, that the well had taken someone, pulled them down, swallowed them whole. The stories were legends in the town, tales told at sleepovers, and shared with whispers under the breath whenever someone dared to bring up the name Graves. It had been abandoned for years, long before Ben's time. No one had lived there in nearly 2 decades, not since the last member of the Graves family had disappeared, leaving behind only the house, the overgrown yard, and the well. Ben's eyes narrowed as he turned off the truck, the engine sputtering to silence. He shouldn't have been here, but something about it, the melody, the way it called to him, kept pulling him back. He'd had enough. He wasn't one to shy away from something like this, especially not after all the stories, all the speculation. He needed to know. He grabbed his flashlight from the passenger seat, slipped out of the truck, and made his way across the grass. His boots crunched on the earth beneath his feet as he walked toward the trees at the back of the property. The tall, thin trunks of the evergreens whispered in the wind, as though they, too, were listening, as if they could hear it, the song. He wasn't alone. Ben stopped at the edge of the woods. The path that led to the well was barely visible, hidden under a blanket of dry leaves and creeping vines. He stood there for a moment, the song still faintly lingering in the distance, curling around him like smoke. "Ben?" A voice called softly from behind him. It was Luke. Of course it was Luke, his best friend, the only one brave or foolish enough to follow him out here. Ben turned to face him. Luke's face was shadowed, his eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. His hoodie was pulled up over his head, and his hands were stuffed into his pockets. "You hear it too?" Ben asked, his voice low. Luke nodded, stepping closer. "Yeah, I thought it was just you at first, messing around with some recording or whatever, but no way. That's real." Ben gave a small, humorless laugh. "I thought so too." He adjusted the flashlight in his hand, his grip tight, though he was doing his best to look casual, like he wasn't already starting to feel the weight of the night pressing down on him. The song was louder now, clearer, as though it were moving closer to them, or maybe they were moving closer to it. Without a word, Ben turned and started down the narrow path, Luke following close behind. The ground was uneven, the air thick with the smell of wet earth, and the trees seemed to close in tighter as they went deeper into the woods. The song was almost tangible now. It was like it was part of the earth itself, part of the very soil, part of the air. It made Ben's skin prickle, and then there it was, the well that had stood for years, overgrown with ivy and choking moss, like some forgotten relic of a time long past. The stone was dark with age, its edges eroded by time and weather, but the hole in the middle, the hole was clear, dark, endless. The song was louder here. It rose up from the depths of the well, a wailing tune that seemed to echo, bouncing off the stone walls and drifting up to them with a power Ben couldn't understand. It was the same melody, but now there was something different in it, a desperation, a hunger, a promise. Ben stood at the edge, the light from his flashlight flickering against the smooth, wet surface. He leaned closer, the faint pull of the song tugging at his thoughts. "Do you think," Luke's voice broke the silence, "do you think it's really coming from down there?" Ben didn't answer. He didn't know. But that didn't stop him from leaning closer to the edge, the beam of light wavering as it skittered over the surface of the water. Suddenly, the song stopped. A silence like nothing Ben had ever heard before. The wind, the trees, everything seemed to hold its breath. It was as though the very world around them had stopped, waiting for something to happen. "Ben?" Luke's voice was barely a whisper, fear creeping into his tone. Ben's heart hammered in his chest. There was something wrong. He could feel it in the air, thick with anticipation. Before he could respond, the song began again, louder this time, closer, more insistent. The sound filled his ears, rushed into his mind like a flood until he couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The darkness of the well seemed to reach up for him, its presence heavy, suffocating. He couldn't pull away. "Ben," Luke said again, and this time there was panic in his voice. But Ben didn't hear him any more. All he could hear was the song, the sound like water rushing over stone, like a voice calling from the depths, like a song he was meant to hear. And then, before he could stop himself, he was stepping forward, his foot lifting into the air. Ben's foot hovered above the earth, his breath a shudder in his chest. The pull from the well was no longer subtle, no longer a whisper in the wind. It was a force, a thing that sank deep into his mind, tugging at his very soul. The song had become more than a melody. It was everything. It was the air, the ground, the gravity that pulled him toward the well's gaping maw. "Ben, what the hell are you doing?" Luke's voice pierced through the thick fog of sound that enveloped him. Ben could barely hear him over the howling song. His head felt heavy, as though the very weight of the world were pressing down on him, pushing him closer to the edge. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His body moved without him, like he was no longer in control. Luke's hand grabbed his arm with a rough tug, pulling him back. But Ben felt nothing. The world around him seemed to recede, as if it were slipping away into darkness, leaving only the well and that sound. Luke's voice was frantic now. "Ben, listen to me! Snap out of it! We need to go! Now!" Ben blinked, slow at first, as if waking from a dream. He felt the pull lessen for a fraction of a second, and in that moment, the darkness that had been creeping into his mind receded just enough for him to take a step back. He gasped for air, the world spinning around him. The well seemed to pulse in the night, the stones wet and slick, gleaming like they were alive. He shook his head violently, his heart pounding in his ears. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth felt dry, his tongue heavy. Luke's grip was tight, frantic, and still. Ben could feel his friend's fear, feel it pressing against him like an invisible force. But then, like an aftershock, the song rose again. This time, it was more than just a sound. It was an assault, a presence. The melody wrapped itself around Ben's chest, constricting his lungs, squeezing the breath from him. His heart thudded harder, a painful throb against his ribs. It was too much. It was too powerful. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. Luke pulled harder, trying to drag Ben back, but it was like pulling at a tree, the roots too deep. Ben felt his body resisting, as though his muscles weren't his own anymore. They were obeying the call. They were part of it. His legs moved, one step forward, then another, and his hand, his own hand, reached out toward the well. "No!" Luke shouted. "Ben, fight it! Fight it!" Ben could feel the weight of his own body being torn apart by the force, and yet he couldn't stop it. He couldn't stop himself. Every instinct he had screamed to flee, to run, to leave this place and never look back. But the song, it wasn't just a song anymore. It was a promise, a whisper that said there was something waiting below, something for him, something he needed to find. And then, without warning, the ground beneath Ben's feet gave way. It wasn't a loud crash. It wasn't like falling through the earth. It was slow, a gradual sinking, as though the earth itself were pulling him in, accepting him as part of its darkness. His body slid downward, as though the very soil was opening beneath him. "Ben! Ben!" Luke's voice was barely a whisper in the chaos of the night. Ben tried to scream, but it was swallowed up by the darkness, by the overwhelming pressure that had closed in around him. The air felt thick, like liquid, wrapping around him. He could no longer hear the night, could no longer feel the earth beneath him. All he could hear was the song, and then nothing. Ben's mind drifted in and out of consciousness. He didn't know how much time had passed. Seconds, minutes, hours. The only thing he was sure of was the cold, the deep, choking cold that seeped into his skin, his bones. It wasn't just the chill of the night. It was something else, something ancient. His hands brushed against something slick. He blinked, eyes blurry, trying to make sense of the world around him. He was no longer in the woods. He wasn't even sure where he was. The space around him was vast, cavernous. There was a sense of weight in the air, pressing down on him as though the darkness was alive, watching. He could feel it in his chest, a pressure like an invisible hand squeezing the air out of his lungs. The song. It hadn't stopped. It was louder now, the melody warped, twisted as it echoed through the cavern. It wasn't like a song anymore. It was something far older, more primal. It was calling to him. Ben's head snapped to the side, his breath ragged, his hands gripping the ground, rough, jagged stone. He wasn't lying on the earth anymore. He was somewhere else. Where? The question swirled in his mind, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered. Not the fear rising in his throat, not the coldness that clung to him, not the way his limbs felt numb, as if they were no longer his. All that mattered was the song, the voice rising and falling like a wind through the trees. Come closer. The thought brushed through his mind like a command, like the whisper of a breath against his ear. It wasn't his own thought. It wasn't his voice. But he knew. He knew. It was the voice from the well, the voice that had been waiting for him. Ben tried to push himself up, but his arms felt weak. They trembled under the strain as if they were refusing to obey him. The ground beneath him shifted. He wasn't sure what he was lying on, but it felt like the earth itself was alive, shifting beneath him, pulsing with a dark energy. The walls, if you could call them that, seemed to be moving as well. The stone around him seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting as though the very structure of the space was alive. It was no longer the earth, it was something else, something that was pulling him in. Ben. Luke's voice, thin and weak, echoed faintly through the darkness. It wasn't the voice of someone standing nearby. It was distant, too distant, as though he were somewhere far off, somewhere Ben couldn't reach. Luke? Ben tried to call, but his voice sounded muffled, distant, as though it too had been swallowed by the darkness. There was no response. And then the silence returned. The darkness swallowed him whole, but he could still hear the song. Ben wasn't sure how long he lay there, disoriented, his body trembling with an unnatural cold. The darkness around him seemed to throb, pulse with a rhythm all its own, and the song, that infernal song, had grown louder, more insistent. It was as though the melody was inside his head now, curling through his thoughts, bending his will. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, but when he tried to move, his limbs felt like they were stuck in wet cement. His muscles didn't obey him, no matter how much he screamed at them. He couldn't escape. This isn't real. The thought was barely a whisper. But then again, everything felt like it was on the edge of reality now. Everything shifting beneath him, like the ground beneath him, could dissolve at any moment. His breath came in shallow gasps, but the more he breathed, the more the air felt wrong, too thick, like he was choking on it. The pressure was building, closing in from all sides, as though the very walls of this place wanted to crush him, to drag him deeper into the earth. He opened his eyes, squinting against the overwhelming dark, trying to see something, anything. But all that greeted him was endless black, a suffocating void that seemed to stretch out forever. There were no stars, no light, only the disembodied song echoing through the cavernous space. It's coming from somewhere, he thought, his mind barely holding on to some semblance of clarity. I have to find where. Ben forced himself to sit up, the motion slow and agonizing, as though every bone in his body was protesting. The stone beneath him was damp, slick with something that felt wrong, like the earth itself was bleeding. His fingers dug into the rough ground, the only thing that seemed real in this place. His skin scraped against the stone, but the pain was muted, far away. All that mattered was the pull of the song, calling to him from the darkness. Find it. Find the source. A hollow laugh bubbled up in Ben's throat. What was he even thinking? He didn't know where he was. He didn't know how he'd gotten here. The well. It had taken him. Somehow, some way, it had pulled him into this place. This dark, twisted underworld of stone and breathless cold. And yet, the more he focused on the song, the more it became familiar. It wasn't just a song. It was something that reached into him, that resonated with something deep inside his chest, as though it was speaking directly to his bones, to the very marrow. His legs were trembling as he pushed himself to his feet, the stone beneath him shifting and groaning as though the earth was reacting to his presence. He couldn't stand still, not anymore. Something was calling him, urging him to go deeper, and the closer he got to it, the louder it became. It was right here, somewhere, within the cavernous walls, beyond his sight, and yet, right there, in his mind. A sudden thought struck him like lightning. I'm not alone. He wasn't. There were others here. They weren't visible. Ben couldn't see anything, but he felt them. Their presence was heavy, like the air itself was thick with it. There was a tension in the dark, an oppressive weight of something waiting, watching. His breath hitched as a whisper, soft at first, then growing louder, scratched at the edges of his mind. Join us! It was unmistakable, the words cutting through the fog of his panic like a blade. He recoiled instinctively, but his body refused to move. His feet felt rooted to the stone, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift in response, as though the very earth was urging him forward. No, I can't. Ben didn't know how he managed to push the thought away, but he did. He had to. The more he thought about it, the more it felt like it would win. The well, the song, whatever it was, it wanted him. It wanted him to stay here, to be a part of whatever twisted reality it had created. He stumbled forward, his eyes searching the dark for any sign of an exit. But there was none. No doors, no windows, just endless blackness that stretched on and on like the world had been swallowed whole. The stone beneath his feet, the pulse of the earth, it felt alive now, alive and watching. And then, through the murk of his thoughts, something caught his attention. A flicker of movement, a figure standing just beyond the reach of the flashlight's beam. Ben's heart skipped a beat. He froze, his body rigid with terror. "Luke?" he whispered hoarsely, his voice shaking. No answer, just the sound of the song, swelling louder, rising in a crescendo of madness. Ben swallowed, trying to steady his breath. He took another hesitant step forward, his heart pounding in his throat. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, its presence heavy in the air. Ben felt something stir in his chest, a memory, a sense of familiarity. I know that figure. The thought sent a wave of nausea through him. He staggered closer, drawn inexplicably to the shadowy form. His hands reached out involuntarily. "Don't." He wanted to scream, but the words were stuck in his throat. And then he was standing in front of it. The figure wasn't human, not anymore. It was barely even a shadow. It was like a wraith, a silhouette of something that used to be human, but had been twisted, distorted, ripped apart by the darkness itself. The figure's eyes, empty black pits, stared into Ben, and he could feel them burrowing deep into his soul, clawing at him, whispering, "Come closer." Ben's pulse quickened. The song swelled around him, no longer just an echo, but a part of him, coursing through his blood, filling his chest, choking his thoughts. He tried to look away, to break the hold it had on him, but the pull was too strong. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. Ben stumbled back, his breath ragged, his heart thundering in his chest. The song had changed, no longer a sweet lullaby, but a scream, a terrible primal wail that rattled his bones, that threatened to tear him apart from the inside. His mind began to unravel, the weight of the song pressing down on him, forcing him to listen. There were no more words, no more whispers, only the raw, endless wail of something trapped in the depths of the earth, something desperate, something alive. The ground beneath him shook violently, and Ben fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the stone. He could feel it now, the presence that had been watching him. It was close. It was here. A hand brushed against his arm, cold and clammy, its fingers long and skeletal. And then the voice again, so close now that it felt like it was right in his ear. Join us. The hand on Ben's arm was freezing, cold and clammy, like the dead fingers of something long buried in the dark. His skin crawled as the touch lingered there, seeping into him like the very chill of the grave. He wanted to scream, wanted to jerk away, but the voice, the horrible voice, was still in his ears, urging him forward, pulling at the very fabric of his thoughts. Join us. The words reverberated through his skull, pounding in time with his heart, until he couldn't tell where the song ended and his own panic began. He fought to move, but his limbs felt stiff, like they didn't belong to him anymore. His body was not his own. It was merely an instrument of the thing that called from below. His breath came in shallow gasps as the world around him darkened even further. The shadows didn't simply shift. They pressed in, surrounding him like an unseen hand, squeezing him from all sides. He could feel his chest constricting as the pressure built, tightening like a vice. Number. He couldn't do this. He couldn't give in to whatever it was. The darkness that was feeding on his fear, the song that was worming its way into his very soul. The hand on his arm withdrew, but its coldness lingered, like the aftertaste of death. Get up. You have no choice now. The words, though silent, were undeniable. They sank into him, wrapping themselves around his thoughts, binding him in chains too strong to break. He wanted to move, to scream, to fight. But there was something deeper now, a sense of inevitability that struck him like a cold, sickening wave. The well had called him, but it wasn't just the well. It was the land, the place, the earth itself. It had been waiting for him all along, pulling him in like a tide that couldn't be stopped. And now it was hungry. Ben forced his eyes open, blinking away the darkness. But even as his eyes adjusted, the cavern around him seemed to stretch, grow deeper, the shadows farther and farther beyond his reach. He was still here. The song had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was no better. The walls felt closer now, oppressive, almost suffocating. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, each thud a warning, each breath a reminder that time was running out. Something whispered in the back of his mind, "You are not alone." It wasn't the same voice he'd heard earlier, but its tone was just as familiar, just as chilling. He turned his head, scanning the darkness, but saw nothing. There was no sign of Luke, no sign of anyone, just the cold, dark air pressing in, the weight of the place bearing down on him. It was then that he felt it, the presence, the thing that had been following him. A cold sensation crawling up the back of his neck like fingers brushing his skin. He felt its eyes on him even though there was nothing visible. It was there, watching, waiting. Ben's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. The well had to be the center of it all. He remembered the stories, old tales of the Graves family, of people who had disappeared, of strange rituals and whispers in the night. The more he thought about it, the more everything seemed to fit together, like pieces of a twisted puzzle that had been waiting to be solved. The song wasn't just a lure, it was a trap for the living, and Ben had fallen into it. You will join us, like the others before you. The voice wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. It pressed against his temples, filling his head, drowning him in the cold, sharp edges of its words. His chest tightened with panic as he fought to push it back. But it was pointless. He couldn't escape it. It was too strong, too deep. The well had already claimed him. He could feel it in his veins now, crawling beneath his skin like a sickness. Join us. The words repeated like a chant, an incantation that echoed through the chamber, vibrating against the walls, the stone, the very earth beneath his feet. Ben squeezed his eyes shut, but the voice still filled his mind, and the weight of it pushed him down, down, deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, there was a sound, a distant, hollow thud. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was enough to make Ben freeze, his breath catching in his throat. The song had stopped, but something had taken its place, something other. Luke? The name was a breathless whisper, escaping his lips before he could stop it. Ben tried to call out again, but his throat was dry, like the air had been sucked out of him, leaving only a hollow emptiness. The thud came again, this time louder, closer, and then a voice, a real voice this time. Ben. Ben's heart skipped in his chest. The voice, though strained, hoarse, and broken, was familiar. It was Luke. Luke! Ben staggered forward, his legs still shaking, still unsteady, but his mind was clear now, as if the fog had started to lift. His feet moved, and for the first time since he'd stepped into this cursed place, he felt like he could think. The song had gone silent, the oppressive pressure lifting just enough for him to move. He followed the sound of Luke's voice through the darkness, but each step he took seemed to pull him farther into the heart of the nightmare. The shadows stretched around him like reaching hands, tugging at him, pulling him backward, urging him to stop. But Ben wasn't stopping. Not now. Not when he could hear Luke. Ben. The voice sounded weaker now, more distant, as though it were coming from deep inside the earth, from the very bowels of the well. Ben's heart pounded in his chest as he stumbled forward, the words cutting through the silence like a beacon, guiding him. He reached out, his hand brushing against something soft, something human. "Luke?" Ben gasped. There was no response, no movement. Ben's heart lurched in his chest as he realized what was wrong. The voice was gone. The soft presence he had felt was gone. All that remained was the echo of his own breath, his own panicked pulse. And then, from the shadows, something moved. It wasn't Luke. It was a figure, tall and thin, hunched over like a grotesque parody of the human form. Its face was obscured by darkness, but Ben could feel its eyes, burning through him, drilling into his soul. The thing was smiling, a grotesque open-mouthed grin that stretched far too wide, too unnaturally. "You should have joined us." The voice wasn't Luke's. It was deep, twisted, and the smile widened. Ben stood frozen, unable to breathe, as the figure's twisted smile spread wider, its teeth sharp and unnatural, like jagged stone or shards of glass. The thing in front of him wasn't human, not anymore. It was something that had once been alive, something that had once walked the earth. But now it was nothing more than a shadow of what it had been. It had been drawn down into the depths of the well, twisted and broken by whatever malevolent force resided there. It didn't speak. It didn't have to. Ben's mind raced, every thought clouded by the suffocating weight of fear that pressed against his chest. The song, that horrible, mournful song, had returned. But this time it was no longer a distant call, no longer something from far below. It was all around him, reverberating in his bones, filling his body with a cold, sickly chill that went straight to his marrow. It was more than a sound. It was alive, and it was consuming him. "Join us." The voice echoed in his head, and he felt the compulsion grow stronger, the coldness seeping into his skin, pulling at him, urging him to move toward the darkness. There was no escape. The song would not let him go. It was a part of him now, pulling him deeper until he could feel the abyss at his feet, a bottomless void that threatened to swallow him whole. "No," Ben whispered through gritted teeth. "Number I won't." But the thing before him moved closer, its movements unnatural, jerky, like a marionette controlled by unseen hands. Each step it took felt wrong, like it was tearing through the very fabric of reality itself. Its eyes, those black, soulless pits, focused on him, and he felt the weight of its gaze like an anchor, dragging him down. "Join us." The words weren't a plea anymore. They were a command, an order. Ben's breath came in shallow gasps as he tried to pull away, but his legs were rooted to the spot. His body refused to obey him. The shadows had him now. The earth itself was pulling him under. And the song, it had become a part of him, an extension of his own heartbeat, filling his chest, stealing his breath. He was trapped. The thing's smile grew wider, its face now a blur of shadow and agony, but the pain behind its eyes, if it even had eyes, was unmistakable. It had been here too long, trapped just like Ben. Only it had been waiting for someone to join it. The song began to shift. It was no longer a gentle, mournful melody. It was something darker now, something desperate. It throbbed, pulsed like a heartbeat, but distorted, twisted by something ancient and hungry. It was pulling at Ben's very soul, calling to him, claiming him. There was no escape. Ben's knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground. The cold stone beneath him felt like ice, like the touch of the dead. The thing in front of him was now right next to him, hovering just out of his reach, its grin so wide it threatened to consume its face entirely. The song crescendoed, the melody rising in a final sickening note before it fell silent. And then, nothing. The silence was deafening. Ben's pulse thudded painfully in his ears, but there was no other sound, no breath, no song, no voice. He could still feel it, though, the presence, the thing. It was there, just out of sight, watching him, waiting. The air was thick with it, like the silence before a storm. Ben knew it was only a matter of time before the thing would take him, before it would drag him down into the well just like the others before him. But there was a flicker of hope, a small ember that still burned in his chest. He was still alive. He still had a chance. He had to fight. He had to escape. He lifted his head, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for a way out. His breath came in short, desperate gasps, and he could feel his body trembling with exhaustion. The song had stopped, but the presence still hung in the air, thick and heavy, like a shroud around him. Ben pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking beneath him, but he couldn't stop now. He had to move. He had to get out. He didn't care what it took. He stumbled forward, every step feeling like a battle. The shadows reached for him, curling around his legs like hands, pulling at him, trying to drag him back into the depths of the well. But Ben fought them off, every fiber of his being screaming for freedom, for escape. Run! The thought burned in his mind, a beacon that guided him through the dark, even as the earth itself seemed to tremble beneath his feet. He could feel the well's pull, the pull of the song, still tugging at him, trying to draw him back. But it wasn't enough anymore. The song had lost its hold. And then he saw it. A faint light, just a glimmer in the distance. It was small, barely visible through the endless blackness. But it was enough. Ben's heart hammered in his chest as he pushed himself toward it, his body moving on instinct, ignoring the pain, ignoring the darkness, ignoring everything but that tiny, flickering hope. The ground beneath him shook again, the walls of the cavern cracking, groaning in protest. The well, the thing that had called to him, was angry, It was trying to stop him. But Ben couldn't turn back now. He reached the light. It wasn't much. A small crack in the earth, a sliver of light breaking through the stone, but it was enough. He could see the opening now, just wide enough for him to crawl through. The ground was soft here, like the earth itself was reaching for him, trying to pull him back. But Ben pushed forward, his hand scrabbling against the stone, the coldness of the earth biting into his skin. He felt the well's presence closing in on him like a dark hand, reaching out from the depths to drag him down. The song was rising again, louder now, but Ben didn't stop. He pushed himself harder, every movement a desperate plea for escape. And then, just as the darkness reached for him, he broke through. He gasped for air, his lungs burning as he pulled himself out into the night. The cool, fresh air filled his chest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he could breathe. The song had faded. The darkness had retreated. Ben looked back at the well, his body shaking, his heart still thundering in his chest. But the well was silent now. The ground was still, and the song was gone. For now. Ben didn't wait. He didn't look back again. He ran. He ran through the woods, through the darkness, away from the well and whatever horrors lay beneath it. He didn't stop until he reached the safety of the road, the lights of town flickering in the distance. But even as he ran, even as the night swallowed him whole, he could still hear it, the faintest echo of the song calling to him from far away. Join us. Eliza had never meant to wander this far off the trail. She had been hiking for hours, following the usual path, the one marked by a faded sign with a warning she had ignored, something about not recommended for experienced hikers. But Eliza wasn't an experienced hiker. She was something worse, a stubborn one. It was a mild spring afternoon, the trees above casting a pleasant dappled light on the forest floor. The breeze was a soft whisper, the kind that made you feel like you weren't entirely alone, as if the earth itself were breathing with you. She had come up here to escape, to be alone for a while. Her life back in the city had become a tangled mess of work and obligations, her relationships strained from too much distance, too much time spent caught in the wrong world. A break was overdue, but the trail, winding through the thick trees and over soft, mossy rocks, had begun to look unfamiliar. She glanced at the faint lines on her map, but the markings didn't match. At first, she thought she'd simply lost her way, but now it felt different, wrong. The sun was beginning its descent behind the tall pines, casting long shadows across the forest. Eliza quickened her pace. The trail had disappeared entirely now, replaced by an uneven path that seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The air grew heavier, thicker, as if the woods themselves had closed in around her, tightening their grip. The uneasy feeling that had been nudging her grew louder, and with it, a creeping sense of anticipation. That odd, almost supernatural pull. She had heard stories, of course. Everyone had. Local legends about travelers who'd gotten lost in these woods, never to be seen again. But it was all superstition, right? Just tales to frighten children and thrill-seekers, the kind of thing you'd hear in a dusty bar after a few drinks. You're being paranoid, Eliza. Just turn around. But when she tried, she couldn't. The trees behind her now seemed to form a solid wall of bark and branches. She could no longer see the faint path she had come down. There was no way back. Panic began to rise in her throat. She wasn't lost. She was trapped. Minutes stretched into hours, the air growing thick as though time had itself slowed. But then, just as the last embers of daylight began to fade, she saw it. A clearing. a small, forgotten village nestled in the heart of the woods. At first, Eliza thought she was imagining it. The village seemed to shimmer in the evening light, its buildings distant, appearing almost as though they were suspended in the air. She blinked and looked again, and there it was, real, yet so strange. The houses were worn, but not abandoned. Everything about the place seemed to pulse with a quiet, eerie life. A village that shouldn't exist, a place from another time, from another world entirely. It was out of place, out of time. The way the trees framed it seemed unnatural, as though they bent and twisted around the settlement in a way that didn't fit the laws of nature. The buildings were small but well kept, with ivy creeping up the brick walls and tiny windows peering out like the eyes of curious creatures. Something in the air felt thick with tension, as if a veil separated the village from reality, and Eliza's presence had pierced that veil. The streets were quiet, the houses lined up neatly along a cobbled road that curled and wound its way to a central square. There was no movement, not a sound, but she couldn't shake the feeling. Someone's here. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She swallowed and took a cautious step forward. The soft crunch of leaves beneath her boots felt far too loud in the silence. She stepped carefully, almost hesitantly, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The air was stagnant, thick with an odd sort of stillness. The moment she stepped closer to the first house, her footfall echoed far too loudly. She paused, looking up at the simple structure, a small cottage with a pale wooden door. A flicker of movement caught her eye, and she turned sharply. A figure stood at the far end of the street, a tall man with a wide-brimmed hat and an unremarkable coat. He was staring at her, but his face was hidden in shadow. Eliza froze, her heart skipping a beat. The man didn't move, didn't blink. She tried to call out, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she took another cautious step forward. Something about his stillness unnerved her, as though he were waiting for her to do something, waiting for her to make the first move. He didn't speak, but Eliza could feel his eyes on her, boring into her like a pair of needles. What is this place? There was no answer. Another figure appeared behind him, then another, all watching, silent, waiting. It wasn't a village, it was a stage, a still life scene that had been frozen in time. Something was terribly wrong. Eliza's mind raced, the confusion swirling into dread. Her eyes darted between the figures, trying to make sense of the strange, almost robotic way they stood there. They weren't moving, not a single muscle twitched. But then, one of the figures, an older man with a thin gray beard, lifted his hand and waved. It wasn't a casual greeting. It was an invitation. His hand held there for a moment, as though he was beckoning her closer, silently urging her to come, to cross that invisible line between here and there. Eliza's heart hammered against her chest. She couldn't just ignore it. She couldn't. This place, this village, it was wrong. But she couldn't walk away either. She wasn't sure why, but she felt compelled to step forward. Each step she took seemed to pull her further into the web of silence that enveloped the village, making her feel as if she were walking deeper into something she couldn't yet understand. She was moving without her consent, like a puppet, the strings pulled tight by some unseen force. When she crossed the street, the village seemed to shift. The figures that had been standing so still now began to move, though not in the way people move. They glided, slid, as if their feet never truly touched the ground. Their eyes, hollow and unblinking, followed her every step. Eliza reached the central square, her senses heightened, every nerve in her body alert. But no sound, not a single noise. The trees were still, no wind, no rustling of leaves, nothing. There was a single bench in the center, old and weathered, its wood cracked with age. A plaque was set into the stone base of the bench, but the words were faded, unreadable. She took a deep breath and sat down, trying to gather herself, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. But there was nothing to make sense of. There was only wrongness, a weight pressing down on her chest, making her breath feel shallow. Her fingers shook as they brushed against the cold stone surface. The last rays of daylight were vanishing behind the trees, and a cold chill began to settle into the air. She could feel it now, the eyes upon her, watching from all sides, waiting. And then, just as she thought she might break from the overwhelming tension, a voice broke through the silence. It was soft, barely above a whisper, but it felt as though it had come from everywhere. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." The words sent a shiver through Eliza's spine, making her blood run cold. She didn't flinch. She couldn't. Instead, she turned slowly, her head still heavy with disbelief, her throat tight with the strange unease that had started to wrap itself around her like a suffocating fog. The village had been quiet for so long, and now, this. The voice had no source. It was as though it had come from the very air itself, a whisper born from the walls of the village, from the trees that stood like silent sentinels in the distance. Eliza's gaze swept across the silent street, the figures that had once stood frozen in place now slowly drawing closer, gliding toward her like shadows that had gained substance. Their eyes, empty and unblinking, never left her. Every one of them was watching her, staring. But it was the older man with the thin gray beard who finally spoke again. His voice, just as soft as before, cut through the stillness like a knife. "You've disturbed something you don't understand." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, a staccato rhythm that matched the rapid pulse of her fear. She swallowed, trying to steady her breath, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the bench. She wanted to speak. She wanted to scream or run or do anything to break this nightmare, but the words felt heavy on her tongue. She could barely bring herself to meet the old man's eyes. The other figures hadn't moved. They simply stood there, waiting, their faces unreadable. "Disturbed?" Eliza found her voice, shaky and strained. "What is this place? Who are you?" The older man's lips twitched, almost as if he was fighting back a smile, though it was a smile that would have made the dead cringe. "We are waiting," he said, his tone far too calm, far too distant. "Waiting for someone like you." Eliza felt a coldness settle deep in her gut. She pushed herself off the bench, her legs unsteady, her feet barely touching the cobbled stones beneath her. She wanted to move, wanted to flee, but every part of her screamed that it would be futile. She was already trapped here, in this impossible place, where the air felt thick and the ground beneath her feet seemed to vibrate with something unnatural, something that wasn't supposed to exist. The old man took a step toward her, his feet never seeming to fully touch the ground. The others followed, their movements slow, deliberate. It was as if they were all part of a single, unified entity, moving in sync with one another as though their bodies were connected by an invisible thread. "You came looking for peace," the man continued, his voice almost gentle now, though his eyes, those hollow, soulless eyes, were anything but kind. "But this is not peace. This is a place of purpose." Eliza took a step back, a sharp instinct pulling her toward the edge of the square. The weight of his words crushed her chest, as if the air had grown heavier. There was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite grasp. It was as though they weren't just looking at her, they were knowing her. Every thought, every fear, every secret she'd ever kept hidden, all laid bare before them. "You should leave," he said finally, a soft command, but it wasn't a suggestion. "You're not meant to stay." "I'm trying to leave," Eliza snapped, her voice rising raw with panic. She turned her back on him, but she felt it, them, still watching, always watching. She wanted to scream, wanted to shake the fear from her body, but the air was too thick, too suffocating. It made every breath a labor. "Turn around," the man said, his voice low but insistent. Reluctantly, Eliza turned back. She didn't want to face him again, but she did. Something told her she had to. She couldn't leave until she understood what was happening here. The world outside, her world, was so far away now, and she didn't know where she was anymore. She was caught between two realities, two worlds, one solid and tangible, the other shifting like sand. The old man's face softened slightly, the look in his eyes both mournful and resigned. "You've come because you needed to escape," he said. "But it's not escape you'll find here, not like you think." Eliza shook her head, her confusion mounting. "Escape from what? What are you talking about?" The man didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to the others, as though gauging their reactions. Then he returned his gaze to her, his eyes clouded with something that looked like sympathy. Or was it pity? Eliza couldn't tell. "You don't remember," he said softly. "None of you ever remember." The word struck her like a slap. What did he mean by that? She opened her mouth to speak, but found that she couldn't. A sense of dread rose in her, so intense it nearly choked her. She wanted to ask him, what didn't she remember? What was happening to her? But the words got caught in her throat, as if the very air itself was preventing her from voicing the question. Something unseen was forcing her to remain silent, as if the village itself was swallowing her words. "You will remember," the man continued, his voice growing more distant, as though he were no longer speaking to her, but to someone else entirely. "In time, you will remember." "Remember what?" Eliza whispered, but she already knew the answer. Whatever he was about to say, whatever he was about to reveal, was something she wasn't prepared for. A soft, wet sound echoed from the shadows behind her. Eliza flinched, whirling around, her eyes scanning the square. The shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, swallowing the last rays of daylight that had lingered in the sky. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled, and she took an involuntary step backward, her pulse quickening. From the edge of the village, figures began to emerge. More of them, stepping out of the shadows, their faces more blurred than the others, their movements slower, more calculated. There were more of them now than Eliza could count, and each of them seemed to stare at her, their eyes hollow, their faces strangely vacant. "They're all waiting for you," the man said, his voice oddly calm in the growing chaos. "For the moment when you realize what you really are." She backed away, her heart racing as she turned and bolted toward the edge of the village. Her feet pounded the cobblestones, her breath coming in sharp gasps as she ran. But the figures behind her didn't move. They didn't chase her, they just watched. But it didn't matter. The farther she ran, the more the world around her began to shift. The trees, the buildings, the very air itself. It all felt like it was bending, warping, until she couldn't tell where the path ended and the village began. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But the moment she turned her head, she saw it. The well. It had appeared out of nowhere, standing in the center of the square, its dark, gaping mouth staring up at her. The well was ancient, its stones crumbling and weathered by time, but it felt alive. It beckoned to her, its dark presence drawing her closer, pulling her in. And then, as she took a step toward it, the whispers began again. "You've come. You've come home." The whispers came from everywhere. They rose like the wind, soft at first, a gentle rustle in the air, until they grew louder, sharper. "You've come home." Eliza's feet froze to the cobblestones as she stared at the well, its dark mouth open like an invitation into a world she had no intention of entering. But her body didn't listen. There was something in the way the well called to her, soft and insistent, like a voice buried deep inside her own mind. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a pull. "Come closer." She took a step back, trying to gather herself, but the moment she did, she felt the air around her close in, like the village was tightening its grip, suffocating her with its silence. The figures in the square hadn't moved, but their presence pressed against her, as though they were waiting for her next move, waiting for her to do the one thing she didn't want to do. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest, a wild rhythm that made it impossible to think clearly. She turned her head, looking for another way out, but the street seemed to close in on her. No path, no escape, just the well, the dark, yawning well, beckoning like a hungry mouth. "You must come. Come closer." She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The sound of the whispers burrowed deep inside her head, scratching at the walls of her sanity, and she found her feet moving again, unwillingly. She couldn't stop herself. She was drawn toward it, like a moth to flame. The others, the figures who had watched her, never blinking, hadn't moved. Yet their eyes seemed to follow her, and Eliza knew that something was changing. The air had thickened, the shadows had deepened, and the village itself seemed to be breathing, in and out, slowly, methodically. With each step she took toward the well, the ground beneath her feet felt less and less solid. Her vision blurred, the world twisting at the edges, and she felt as if she were walking in a dream. No, a nightmare. Time itself was starting to shift, to bend, to break. The well stood before her now, the stone walls slick with damp moss. It felt ancient, older than the village itself, older than anything Eliza could comprehend. She couldn't explain it, but there was something familiar about it, something that sent a cold chill through her spine. The whispering voices grew louder. It was a chorus now, a symphony of dark sounds filling her mind, drowning out everything else. The village, the trees, the figures watching from the shadows. All of it was swallowed by the voices. "Come, come to us." A light, flickering in the depths of the well, beckoned her forward. It was the same light that had pulled her here, the same pull that had yanked at her very soul since the moment she stepped into the village. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. Her body was already at the edge, looking down into the black void. The well had no bottom. It went on forever, deeper than any well had a right to go. And yet, there was something at the very bottom, something waiting. "Come to us. You belong here." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Her pulse raced in her ears, pounding like a drum, drowning out the voices, the pull, everything. She stepped closer. The shadows seemed to reach for her, and the coldness from the well seemed to seep into her bones, pulling at her insides. And still, The whispers called her, soft at first, a sweet lullaby that promised release from the pain, from the confusion, from the world outside. Come, come to us. The air around her seemed to darken, and the ground beneath her feet became slippery. She could hear the sound of water, soft at first, like a murmur, and then louder, rising, rushing, churning in the depths of the well. But it wasn't water. It was something else, something that made her heart race. She reached out, her hands trembling, not able to stop herself, not able to pull away. Her fingers brushed against the cold stone of the well's edge, and as they did, a flash of memory struck her, like a sudden bolt of lightning, sharp and blinding, a flash of a time before, a time that she couldn't remember. A voice, her voice, calling out, crying, asking for help, screaming. But it wasn't just her voice. It was many voices, the sound of a chorus, a choir of desperate souls, trapped and screaming. They were calling to her, pulling at her, and her own voice joined in, as if it had always been there, buried deep inside. The ground shifted beneath her. Her body swayed, teetering on the edge of the well, and for the first time, Eliza could hear the voices clearly. It wasn't just the whispering that filled her head. It was the sound of flesh being torn, of bones snapping, of things crawling and pulling in the darkness below. Her body lurched forward, her feet sliding on the slick stones of the well. She reached out, trying to stop herself, but it was too late. Her fingers brushed the edge, and in that moment, the whispers screamed, "You belong to us!" It was a roar now, deafening, and the ground shook beneath her. She screamed, her voice lost in the roar of the darkness. The well seemed to open wide, swallowing everything around her, and she felt herself falling into the blackness, into the darkness that had been waiting for her. Eliza opened her eyes. The world was still dark, but she wasn't falling anymore. She was somewhere. She couldn't tell where. It was cold, so cold, and her body ached as though she had been stretched thin, pulled apart. She tried to move, but her limbs felt heavy, like they were made of stone. She blinked, trying to focus, but there was nothing to focus on, nothing but shadows. The air around her smelled of damp earth, of decay, and then she heard it again, the whispering, soft at first, but growing louder, filling the empty space around her. "You're one of us now." She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her throat was dry, cracked. She could feel it, the pressure in her chest, the weight of the voices pressing down on her. She was no longer in the village. She was somewhere else, somewhere darker. "They're waiting for you." Eliza's heart hammered in her chest. The voices, those voices, were no longer whispers. They were real. They were calling to her, pulling at her, and she couldn't stop herself. She had been chosen, and now she was part of them. A cold laugh echoed in the distance, and Eliza tried to move, tried to run, but it was hopeless. Her legs wouldn't cooperate. Her body was no longer hers. The well had claimed her. She had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. Eliza tried to move, but her limbs were frozen, heavy, as though her body had become part of the ground beneath her. The cold wrapped around her like a shroud, numbing her skin, sinking deep into her bones. Her mind was screaming, but no sound came. Her heart beat in her chest like a hollow drum, slow and unsteady. But the pressure in her head wouldn't let up, the voices growing louder by the second. "You're one of us now." The words echoed over and over, and with each repetition, a dark understanding grew inside her, a horrible sinking realization that she couldn't escape. that there was no going back. She wasn't just trapped in the village anymore. No, this place, this other place, was something more. Something that didn't belong in the world she knew. The village had been the door. The well had been the key. But now, she was beyond the door. Her vision swam in the darkness, shadows shifting in the corner of her eyes. She strained against the invisible chains that bound her, forcing herself to move, to scream, to do anything. But it was no use. Her body wouldn't obey. Her muscles screamed in protest, her every nerve alight with panic. But it felt like there was no space left for her. Only the cold, only the voices. She was drowning in them. Come closer. The voice came from everywhere. It was a low, hissing whisper that slid into her ears like poisoned honey. It filled her mind, crawling into the deepest recesses of her thoughts, weaving around her memories, distorting them. She could feel her sense of self slipping away, bit by bit, like sand through an open hand. And then she heard it. The creak of wood, a door opening somewhere in the distance, faint but undeniable. She tried to focus on it, to break free from the tightening knot of terror in her chest, but the shadows pressed in around her, and she felt as if she were being suffocated by them. The laughter began then, soft at first, like an old woman's cackle, but it grew louder, richer, until it was a guttural sound, deep and mocking. The shadows stretched, elongating, twisting, pulling her deeper into the dark. She could feel it now, an unnatural chill clinging to her skin, burrowing inside her, crawling under her flesh, settling in her very marrow. She was no longer in the village. She wasn't even in her own world. She was somewhere else. You've crossed over, Eliza. Her breath caught. The voice, this voice, was different. It was more powerful, more insistent. It was older, colder, and familiar. Her mind tried to latch onto it, to figure out where it had come from. But there was only darkness. There was only the cold and the voices, growing louder. But then a shape emerged from the shadows. At first, it was a blur, nothing more than a vague silhouette in the dark. But as it drew closer, Eliza's eyes widened in horror, her heart hammering painfully against her ribs. A figure, tall, skeletal, with skin the color of ash, stepped forward, its eyes hollow and empty, like two pits of despair. Its mouth stretched open in a thin, lipless grin. It didn't walk. It glided, like it was part of the very air, the very darkness around her, and it was staring at her. Her body shuddered, but she couldn't look away. The hollow eyes seemed to see right through her, piercing her soul with a coldness that made her want to shrivel into nothing. You are here because you belong. The voice spoke to her, deep in her mind, like a whisper from the very heart of the darkness. Eliza could feel it now, the hunger. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the ground, in the air itself. It wasn't just the figure that was watching her. There were others, too. More figures emerging from the shadows. They moved in silent procession, each of them tall and thin, their faces gaunt, their eyes empty, their mouths twisted into cruel, cruel smiles. Come closer. The words echoed in her head again, soft at first, coaxing her forward, but then harder, insistent, demanding. You've crossed into our world. You've crossed into ours. And now you will stay. A cold hand brushed against her cheek, and Eliza jerked back, her heart racing. But there was no escape. The darkness had already swallowed her whole. The figure with the hollow eyes reached toward her, its skeletal fingers brushing the air just an inch from her face. Its smile widened, too wide, impossibly wide, stretching until it nearly split its face in two. It's time. Eliza didn't understand. She didn't want to understand. Her mind was screaming, urging her to run, but her legs were still frozen in place. Her hands twitched, wanting to push away, to shove the figure back into the shadows, but they couldn't move. She was trapped in this place where time no longer existed, where there was no escape. The figure's fingers touched her skin, cold as ice, sending a shock wave through her body. The cold seeped in, flooding her veins, numbing her skin, making her feel like she was being drained of everything, her thoughts, her memories, her very essence. The more it touched her, the more she felt herself slipping away. "You're ours now. You always were." Her vision blurred again, and then, in the distance, something changed. A light, weak at first, but it grew, a pale glow in the midst of the endless shadows. She wanted to reach for it, to run to it, but the figure's fingers gripped her tighter, pulling her back, keeping her tethered in the dark. No escape. The whisper burned through her mind, searing her thoughts. She fought against it, against the weight of the darkness that was crushing her. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The voices, the cold, the figures, they were all becoming one. It wasn't just a village anymore. It was a place outside of time, outside of reality, a place for the forgotten, for those who had crossed. And Eliza understood then. The well, the village, it had been waiting for her to come, waiting for her to cross. Her pulse hammered in her ears as the figures closed in around her. She felt the pressure building, suffocating, until her chest ached. She wanted to scream, but there was nothing left. No voice, no will. She was already gone, a part of them, a part of the village. The well had claimed her, and she had become part of it. There was nothing left of Eliza now, nothing but the darkness and the voices, the hollow eyes. "You are one of us now." Eliza's heart pounded in her chest, a heavy, uneven throb, as the hollow-eyed figure loomed closer. Its skeletal fingers scraped the air, pulling the very shadows with it. There was no escape, no reason, no reality beyond the reach of this forsaken place. The very fabric of her being seemed to be unraveling, each moment slipping further into oblivion, until only the darkness remained. "You are ours now." The words lingered in her mind, not spoken, but felt. A cold pressure behind her eyes, crawling down her spine, suffocating her thoughts. She wanted to scream, wanted to claw her way out of this nightmare, but her mouth wouldn't open, her body wouldn't move. It was as if she were trapped in a cocoon of fear and silence. The figure leaned closer, its eyes, those black, empty sockets, staring into hers, deeper than anything she had ever known. There was no pity in those eyes, no recognition, just an abyss that stretched on forever. And then, as if in response to her despair, the whispers rose once more. But now they weren't from just one voice. They were from everyone, from all the hollow-eyed villagers, from the very air itself, from the well. The song that had drawn her here was now clear, the haunting melody she had heard echoing in her head as though it had been written into her very soul. "We wait for those like you, the ones who don't remember, the ones who wander too close." Suddenly, the weight of it all pressed down on her chest, her past, her memories, everything she had ever been, vanishing, slipping into the dark. She remembered something flickered like a candle, struggling to stay lit, but it was fleeting. Her hands, once warm, now numb, gripped at the cold ground, as if pulling at some invisible thread. trying desperately to return to what was real. But it was too late. There is no escape now. She had crossed the threshold. The village had claimed her, the well had claimed her, and the shadowed things that resided here in this twisted dimension had long since forgotten what it meant to let go. The pencil felt alien in his hand, a cold, lifeless thing that refused to dance the way it once had. It sat there, trembling in his grip, hovering over a blank sheet of paper that might as well have been a white void. His apartment, a small and cluttered loft on the outskirts of the city, was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wood. Jonas leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his unruly black hair. The walls around him were covered in failed attempts, half-finished sketches, smudged charcoal lines, and portraits that didn't quite look human. Art had always been his escape, his salvation in a world that often felt too big, too loud, and too cruel. But for weeks now, it had turned against him, his muse slipping through his fingers like smoke. He glanced at the clock. 2:17 a.m. Sleep was a distant concept, and the caffeine-fueled haze of the night only made the silence heavier. The weight of it pressed down on him, threatening to smother. And then it happened. Jonas blinked, startled by the sudden motion of his own hand. He hadn't meant to move it, hadn't even decided to draw. But there it was, gliding across the page in sharp, deliberate strokes. The pencil scratched against the paper, urgent and unrelenting, like a creature trying to claw its way out. When he finally stopped, his chest was heaving, his hand ached, and his fingers were smudged with graphite. He looked down at the page, expecting a mess of incoherent lines, but what stared back at him made his stomach lurch. It was a figure, though calling it human would be generous. It stood tall and thin, its body composed of jagged, shadowy shapes that seemed to pulse with unnatural energy. Where its face should have been, there was only a void, a hollow darkness that seemed to watch him, even as it lacked eyes. Jonas felt a chill crawl up his spine. He didn't remember drawing it, didn't remember deciding what it should look like. Yet there it was, a creature birthed from the depths of his subconscious, staring at him with an emptiness that made his skin crawl. He tore the page from the sketchbook and crumpled it into a ball, tossing it into the wastebasket. A nervous laugh escaped his lips as he pushed himself away from the desk. "Just tired," he muttered to no one in particular. He flicked off the desk lamp and stumbled to bed, his mind a swirl of unease and exhaustion. Jonas awoke to the sound of scratching. At first, he thought it was a dream, the remnants of some nocturnal nightmare clinging to the edges of his consciousness. But the sound persisted, faint and rhythmic, coming from the corner of the room. He sat up, his heart pounding, and strained his ears. The loft was dark, the only light coming from the pale glow of the street lamp outside. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The noise was coming from his desk. Jonas swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He reached for the lamp on his bedside table and flicked it on, bathing the room in a warm, yellow light. The sound stopped instantly. He stared at the desk, his breath caught in his throat. The sketchbook sat where he'd left it, closed and undisturbed. Slowly, cautiously, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and padded across the room. The floor creaked under his weight, each step echoing in the stillness. He reached the desk and hesitated. His fingers hovered over the cover of the sketchbook, a knot tightening in his stomach. Finally, he opened it. The page was blank. Jonas let out a shaky breath, relief washing over him. He flipped through the other pages, just to be sure, and found nothing but the same failed attempts he'd seen before. "Get a grip," he whispered, closing the sketchbook and setting it aside. He turned to leave, but something caught his eye. The wastebasket. The crumpled drawing he'd tossed earlier was sitting on top of the other trash. He didn't remember seeing it before, didn't remember the lines of shadow and void staring back at him like a memory that refused to be forgotten. His hands trembled as he reached for the paper. He smoothed it out on the desk, the jagged figure now more unsettling in the lamplight. It felt wrong, like something he shouldn't be looking at, something that didn't belong in the world. Jonas stared at it for what felt like hours, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. Finally, he shoved it back into the trash and returned to bed, pulling the covers over his head like a child hiding from the monsters in the dark. But the scratching came back. The next morning, Jonas tried to convince himself it had been a dream. The strange drawing, the noises in the night. It was all just a product of his overworked, sleep-deprived mind. But the unease lingered, a shadow in the back of his thoughts. He avoided his desk, opting instead to spend the day in the kitchen with his sketchbook closed and untouched. By the time night fell, he felt more like himself. The logical part of his brain had taken over, dismissing the events as nothing more than a bad night. But when he finally opened the sketchbook, his heart sank. There it was, the figure. It stared back at him from a fresh page, its jagged, shadowy form more defined than before. The hollow void where its face should have been seemed to pull at him, drawing his gaze into its emptiness. Jonas slammed the book shut, his pulse hammering in his ears. He didn't draw it. He couldn't have. Could he? He grabbed the sketchbook and flipped through the other pages. They were all the same. Every blank page had been filled with variations of the same figure, each one more detailed, more menacing than the last. Panic clawed at his chest. He threw the sketchbook across the room, watching as it skidded across the floor and came to a stop near the window. For the first time in years, Jonas was afraid of his own work. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and restless paranoia. No matter how many times he threw the drawings away, they always found their way back. The figures grew sharper, their hollow faces darker, their shadowy limbs longer. Jonas began seeing them in his peripheral vision, fleeting glimpses of movement that vanished the moment he turned his head. They were in the corners of his apartment, in the shadows of the stairwell, in the reflective surfaces of windows and mirrors, and they were getting closer. Part 1 ends with Jonas standing in front of his desk, staring at the sketchbook as it lies open to yet another drawing of the shapeless thing. His hand moves on its own, picking up the pencil and hovering over the page. He doesn't want to draw, doesn't want to give it form, but he doesn't have a choice. Jonas stood at his desk, staring at the open sketchbook. His hand moved on its own, clutching the pencil and hovering over the blank page. He didn't want to draw, didn't want to give it form, but he didn't have a choice. The pencil trembled in Jonas's hand, its tip poised against the stark white of the page. His breathing grew ragged, shallow gasps escaping his throat as he tried to wrest back control. It wasn't just his hand that betrayed him. It was something deeper, a presence that lived in his mind like a parasite. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound came from the paper, though the room was otherwise silent. Jonas watched in horror as his hand began to move, guided by an unseen force. The pencil glided across the page, tracing lines that were jagged and wrong, but with an awful precision. The figure began to take shape again, its shadowy limbs twisting in unnatural angles, its void-like face staring back at him as if it were alive. "No," Jonas whispered, his voice cracking. He tried to stop, to drop the pencil, to rip the page from the sketchbook, but his body refused to obey. His hand worked tirelessly, sketching every grotesque detail as though compelled by something ancient and hungry. When it was done, he collapsed into the chair, the pencil clattering to the floor. His chest heaved as he stared at the figure he had drawn, or rather, the figure that had been drawn through him. This one was different, more detailed, more vivid. Its limbs stretched impossibly long, curling like the roots of a dying tree. The void where its face should have been seemed to pulse, as though it were breathing. Jonas shoved the sketchbook away and stumbled back from the desk, his pulse pounding in his ears. His eyes darted to the corners of the room, the shadows suddenly feeling alive, shifting, moving. It wasn't just in his head. It couldn't be. That night, sleep came reluctantly, and only after Jonas had barricaded the sketchbook in a closet. But his dreams offered no sanctuary. He found himself in a vast, dark expanse. The air was thick and heavy, pressing against his chest like a physical weight. He couldn't see his hands, couldn't even tell if he was standing or floating. Then the whispers began, low, guttural murmurs that slithered into his ears like worms. He couldn't make out the words, but the intent was clear. The whispers wanted him to listen, to obey, to create. Jonas turned, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure was there, standing in the distance. Or was it closer? Its form seemed to shift, growing larger and smaller at the same time. The hollow void of its face drew him in, pulling him like a moth to a flame. And then it moved. Jonas jolted awake, drenched in sweat and tangled in his sheets. His heart thundered in his chest as he scanned the room, half expecting to see the figure standing at the foot of his bed. But the room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator, a mocking echo of normalcy. By the next morning, Jonas knew he was losing his grip on reality. The lines between his waking life and his dreams had blurred, the figure seeping into both. He avoided the sketchbook at all costs, refusing to even glance at the closet where he had hidden it. Instead, he threw himself into distractions, cleaning the apartment, reorganizing the kitchen, anything to keep his hands and mind occupied. But the distractions didn't last. The whispers began again, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in a distant wind. They weren't in his head this time. Jonas froze, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. The whispers were coming from the living room, from the direction of the closet. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "This isn't real. It's not real." But the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Against his better judgment, Jonas crept toward the closet. Each step felt like a march toward his own doom. His hand shook as he reached for the doorknob, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. When he opened the door, the sketchbook was sitting on the floor, its cover open. The figure stared up at him from the page, more vivid than ever. It seemed to ripple, the shadows of its limbs shifting slightly, as though it were trying to claw its way out of the paper. Jonas stumbled back, his legs giving out beneath him. He hit the floor hard, but the pain barely registered. The whispers grew louder, filling the room, filling his head. They weren't just words anymore, they were commands. Draw. Jonas tried to fight it, but the compulsion was too strong. His hands moved of their own accord, pulling the sketchbook into his lap and flipping to a blank page. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I won't. I won't." But his hands didn't care. The pencil moved again, the lines sharp and deliberate. The figure grew more detailed, its limbs stretching beyond the confines of the page. Jonas's vision blurred as he worked, his body trembling with the effort to stop. By the time he finished, tears were streaming down his face. The new drawing was even worse than the last. The figure seemed to have broken free of the page, its limbs extending outward like tendrils, reaching for him. And in the center of its hollow face, a faint light began to glow. That night, Jonas didn't sleep. He sat in the corner of his apartment, clutching a kitchen knife like a lifeline. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist and writhe, forming shapes that disappeared as soon as he looked at them. The whispers were constant now, a low, maddening hum that gnawed at the edges of his sanity. By dawn, Jonas was a wreck. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling with exhaustion. He hadn't eaten in over a day, his stomach churning with anxiety. But he knew one thing. He couldn't stay in the apartment. He grabbed the sketchbook and stuffed it into a bag, determined to rid himself of it once and for all. He didn't care where it ended up, so long as it was far away from him. As Jonas stepped out into the cold morning air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The shadows seemed darker, the air heavier. The whispers followed him, growing fainter as he walked, but never truly fading. He didn't have a plan, didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he had to keep moving. But no matter how far he walked, the feeling didn't go away, because the figure wasn't just in the sketchbook anymore. It was in the world. Jonas had fled his apartment, desperate to rid himself of the cursed sketchbook that seemed to channel the shapeless figure into existence. But as he stood in the middle of a deserted street, he realized with bone-deep dread that the shadows around him weren't random. They were moving, limbs stretching, twisting, reaching. The figure was here, and it was no longer bound by the pages of his sketchbook. The early morning streets were eerily empty, the kind of emptiness that pressed against Jonas's chest like a weight. Normally, even this quiet corner of the city would hum with life, commuters trudging to work, street vendors setting up shop. But now, it was as though the world had gone still just for him. Jonas clutched the strap of his bag, his fingers aching from the tight grip. The sketchbook sat inside like a festering wound, radiating unease. The shadows in the alleyways seemed to ripple and pulse, creeping closer every time he blinked. "Keep moving," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. But where could he go? Jonas forced himself to walk, his legs stiff and unsteady. Every step felt like a gamble, as though the ground beneath him might collapse at any moment. The city felt alien now, its familiar landmarks distorted and warped by the weight of his fear. At first, he thought it was paranoia, the way the shadows seemed to lean toward him, stretching long and thin under the pale light of the street lamps. But then he saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The alley behind him was empty, its darkness thick and impenetrable. "You're losing it," he muttered, shaking his head. But the unease didn't fade. Jonas quickened his pace, his boots scuffing against the cracked pavement. The whispers that had plagued him in his apartment were gone, but the silence that replaced them was worse. It pressed against his ears, a deafening void that made every creak and rustle feel amplified. He stopped in front of a dumpster, its rusted metal surface pockmarked with graffiti. This was as good a place as any, he thought. He could dump the sketchbook here, leave it behind, and never look back. With trembling hands, Jonas unzipped his bag and pulled out the sketchbook. The cover felt warm to the touch, like it was alive. He hesitated, his grip faltering as a wave of nausea rolled over him. What if it followed him? The thought was ridiculous, wasn't it? It was just a book, just paper and graphite. But the figure... Jonas shook his head violently, forcing the thought away. He threw the sketchbook into the dumpster and slammed the lid shut, the clang echoing down the empty street. For a moment, relief washed over him. He turned and walked away, his steps lighter, his chest less tight. But the feeling didn't last. It started as a faint rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across the pavement. Jonas froze mid-step, his blood running cold. The noise grew louder, more deliberate. He turned slowly, his breath catching as his eyes fell on the dumpster. The lid was open. Jonas stumbled backward, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. The sketchbook sat on top of the trash, its cover flapping in a non-existent breeze. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. He wanted to run, to leave the cursed thing behind, but his body wouldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the ground, his gaze locked on the sketchbook as it began to tremble. The pages flipped on their own, the sound of paper rustling sharp in the silence. Jonas could see the figure on the pages, its shadowy limbs stretching and writhing like it was alive. And then it rose. Jonas's mind struggled to comprehend what he was seeing. The figure pulled itself free of the sketchbook, its jagged form coalescing into something solid. It moved like smoke, its limbs flowing and reshaping as it stepped out of the dumpster, the void where its face should have been turned toward Jonas. He ran. Jonas's lungs burned as he sprinted down the empty streets, his bag bouncing against his back. He didn't dare look behind him, didn't want to see if the figure was following. But he could feel it, the oppressive weight of its presence, the way the shadows seemed to stretch toward him, clawing at his heels. He turned a corner and darted into an alley, pressing himself against the wall. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, his eyes darting wildly. The shadows in the alley were deep and unmoving, but Jonas didn't trust them. He clutched the knife he'd taken from his kitchen, the blade trembling in his grip. Minutes passed. The street beyond the alley remained silent. Jonas dared to peek around the corner. The street was empty, the dumpster far behind him. Maybe he'd lost it. But as he turned back into the alley, his blood ran cold. The figure was there, standing at the far end of the alley. Its form was hazy, like smoke struggling to take shape, but its presence was suffocating. Jonas stumbled back, his heart hammering in his chest. The knife slipped from his fingers and clattered to the ground. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there, its hollow face watching him. Jonas felt tears sting his eyes. "What do you want from me?" he screamed, his voice echoing off the brick walls. The figure tilted its head, its movements slow and deliberate, and then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, more like the sound of wind howling through broken windows, it spoke. "Draw." Jonas woke up on the ground, the sky above him a pale gray. For a moment, he thought it had all been a dream. The alley was empty, the figure gone. But when he sat up, he saw the sketchbook lying next to him, open to a new page. The figure was there again, more vivid than ever. Jonas's hand shook as he picked it up. His own name was scrawled beneath the drawing in jagged, unfamiliar handwriting. The whispers returned, louder this time, clawing at his sanity. Jonas knew now that the figure wouldn't let him go. And worse, he wasn't sure he wanted it to. Jonas found himself lying in the alley, the pale morning sky above him. For a fleeting moment, he thought it had all been a terrible dream, but the sketchbook beside him told a different story. The figure was drawn there again, more vivid than ever, and beneath the image, his own name was scrawled in jagged, unfamiliar handwriting. As the whispers grew louder in his mind, Jonas clutched the sketchbook to his chest, torn between fear and a twisted sense of inevitability. The world outside the sketchbook felt muted, as though it had been stripped of color and sound. Jonas walked through the city streets, clutching the cursed book to his chest like a lifeline. His steps were aimless, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. The whispers were louder now, their guttural voices clawing at his mind. They were no longer content with just demanding. They were promising power, freedom, a release from the suffocating despair that had consumed his life before all of this began. Jonas stopped in front of a coffee shop, staring blankly at the cheerful sign in the window. Open for all. The warmth of the slogan felt grotesque, an insult to the storm raging inside him. The people inside looked so normal, their lives untouched by the horrors that had latched onto him. He envied their ignorance, the bliss of never knowing that the world had cracks where something ancient and wrong could slip through. He turned away, the sketchbook pressing against his ribs like a second heartbeat. By the time he reached his apartment, the sun was setting. The orange glow spilled through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. Jonas locked the door behind him, sliding the deadbolt into place with trembling fingers. He placed the sketchbook on the kitchen table, staring at it as though it were a venomous snake. The drawing of the figure stared back at him, its hollow face seemingly deeper, darker, more alive. Jonas grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet and took a long, burning swig. The liquid did little to calm his nerves, but it gave him enough courage to act. "I'll burn you," he muttered, his voice slurred with desperation. "I'll end this." He grabbed a lighter from the counter and held the flame close to the edge of the sketchbook. The paper began to curl and darken, the scent of burning graphite filling the air. But then the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Jonas stumbled back, clutching his head as pain lanced through his skull. The sketchbook slammed shut on its own, the flame extinguished. "You cannot destroy what is already free." The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a presence, a weight that filled the room and pressed against his chest. Jonas collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. When he looked up, the figure was there, standing in the corner of the room. It was no longer confined to the page. Its limbs stretched and twisted, merging with the shadows on the walls. The void where its face should have been pulsed, a black hole that seemed to suck in all light and sound. Jonas tried to scream, but no sound came out. When he came to, he was back at the table, the sketchbook open in front of him. The lighter lay discarded on the floor. His hand moved on its own, gripping the pencil tightly as it scratched across the page. Jonas tried to resist, but the pull was stronger this time. The whispers filled his mind, promising that this was the only way to survive, the only way to keep the figure at bay. As the pencil moved, the figure on the page grew more detailed, more grotesque. Its limbs branched out like the veins of a dead leaf, and its hollow face seemed to stare into Jonas's soul. When the drawing was complete, Jonas collapsed back into the chair, his chest heaving. The figure on the page was no longer alone. Jonas had drawn himself. The days that followed blurred together. Jonas barely left his apartment, the walls closing in as the whispers grew louder. The figure was always there, watching him from the corners, its presence a constant weight. It didn't speak again, but it didn't need to. Its demands were clear: keep drawing. And Jonas obeyed. The sketchbook filled rapidly, page after page of horrors spilling from his trembling hands. The figures he drew grew more numerous, their forms more intricate and nightmarish. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were entities, each one unique and alive in its own awful way. The whispers began to change, their tone shifting from demanding to reverent. Jonas realized with a sickening clarity that they weren't just voices. They were the entities themselves speaking to him through the pages. He was no longer their prisoner. He was their creator. Late one night, as Jonas sat hunched over the sketchbook, the pencil moving in feverish strokes, he felt a sudden, eerie calm. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a profound silence. He looked up and froze. The walls of his apartment were covered in shadows, but they weren't his. They were the figures he had drawn, their limbs twisting and writhing as they crawled toward him. The figure, the original, the one that had started it all, stood at the center of the room, its void-like face turned toward him, and for the first time, Jonas felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He dropped the pencil, his hands falling limply to his sides. "Is this what you wanted?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't answer. It didn't need to. The shadows surged forward, engulfing Jonas in their embrace. The world dissolved into darkness, and for the first time in weeks, Jonas felt free. Jonas, consumed by the darkness he had unwittingly unleashed, disappeared into the shadows that had overtaken his apartment. The figures he had drawn, the entities that had whispered and demanded, had engulfed him in a final crushing embrace. Left behind on the table was the sketchbook, its pages heavy with horrors, but the final page, blank, waiting. The apartment sat in eerie silence for days, maybe weeks. Outside, life carried on. Delivery trucks rumbled past. Neighbors argued about trivialities, and the world remained blissfully unaware of what had transpired within these walls. The landlord eventually arrived, frustrated by the unpaid rent and the silence from Jonas. He unlocked the door with a grumble, muttering about evictions and deadbeats. What he found inside froze him in his tracks. The apartment was dark despite the midday sun, its windows obscured by a thick layer of grime that hadn't been there before. The air was stale, heavy with an inexplicable weight, and the faint smell of charcoal lingered. The landlord stepped inside cautiously, his footsteps muffled as though the floor absorbed the sound. His gaze fell on the table, and his brow furrowed. The sketchbook lay there, its black cover glossy under the dim light. Next to it, a pencil rested at an odd angle, as though it had been dropped mid-stroke. He wasn't an art enthusiast, but curiosity tugged at him. He reached for the book, flipping it open to the first page. His breath caught in his throat. The drawings were unnerving, shadowy figures with elongated limbs and hollow faces. They seemed to writhe on the page, as though the lines themselves were alive. Each image was more grotesque than the last, the details so vivid they felt less like sketches and more like windows into another world. The landlord slammed the book shut, his hands trembling. He didn't know much about Jonas, but he knew enough to understand that something terrible had happened here. "Not my problem," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. He stuffed the sketchbook into his bag, intending to toss it out with the trash. But he didn't. The landlord, whose name was Boyd, couldn't bring himself to throw the book away. It sat on his kitchen counter for days, untouched but never out of sight. Something about it gnawed at him, an insistent pull he couldn't ignore. One night, after a particularly restless evening of pacing and chain-smoking, Boyd gave in. "Just one look," he muttered, opening the sketchbook again. The drawings seemed different this time. The figures were still there, but they felt closer. Their forms were sharper, their hollow faces more focused, as though they were watching him. His hand drifted toward the pencil without thinking. "Don't be stupid," he said aloud, but the words sounded hollow. The pencil felt warm in his hand, almost alive. Boyd stared at the blank page, the empty expanse calling to him. He hesitated, but only for a moment. The first line was hesitant, shaky, but as the pencil moved, the lines became smoother, more deliberate. His mind went blank, his hand moving as though guided by an unseen force. When he finally stopped, Boyd stared down at the page, his heart pounding. He had drawn himself. The whispers began that night. They came as he lay in bed, half asleep, the apartment dark and suffocating. At first, they were faint, indistinct murmurs that he dismissed as the wind, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they were a cacophony of voices that filled his mind. "Draw." Boyd sat up, his heart hammering in his chest. He looked toward the kitchen, where the sketchbook sat on the counter. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. But the whispers didn't stop. They followed him throughout the next day, a constant grating presence in his mind. By evening, Boyd was exhausted, his resistance worn thin. He picked up the pencil again. This time the lines came easier. The figures he drew were grotesque, their forms twisting and writhing on the page. He didn't know where the images came from. He wasn't an artist, hadn't drawn anything since grade school, but they flowed from his hand like water. When he finished, he felt a strange mix of relief and dread. But the figures weren't satisfied. Boyd's world began to unravel. The whispers grew louder, invading his every thought. He stopped going to work, stopped answering his phone. His apartment became a prison, the walls closing in as the shadows deepened. The figures he drew began to change. They became more vivid, more detailed, their hollow faces filled with an eerie intelligence. Boyd realized with growing horror that they were watching him. One night, as he stared at the sketchbook, the whispers changed. "Finish it." He didn't know what they meant, but the urgency in their voices was undeniable. Boyd picked up the pencil, his hand trembling. The lines flowed faster and faster, his mind blank as the page filled with shapes and shadows. He didn't stop, didn't look up, until the sketchbook was full. When he finally put down the pencil, he felt a crushing sense of finality. The room was silent, and then the shadows began to move. The police found Boyd's apartment 2 weeks later, after neighbors complained about the smell. The scene they walked into was inexplicable. The walls were covered in shadows, shapes that twisted and writhed, despite the officers' flashlights. Boyd was gone, but the sketchbook sat on the table, its cover pristine despite the chaos around it. One of the officers, a rookie named Carla, picked it up, her curiosity getting the better of her. The last page was blank. "Creepy," she muttered, tucking the sketchbook under her arm. She told herself she'd turn it in as evidence. But that night, as she sat in her apartment, the book called to her, and the pencil was waiting. The wind in the Arctic wasn't just cold, it was merciless. It tore through the skin and bone, biting into the marrow, as though it wanted to get inside you and never leave. It howled endlessly, like a choir of the damned, a sound that became part of the landscape itself. For the team stationed at Outpost Kaldvik, it was the kind of noise you learned to live with, or went mad trying. Dr. Callum Reeve, head of the expedition, stood at the edge of the observation deck, staring into the endless white void. The horizon stretched out like an empty canvas, smeared with gray clouds that promised another brutal snowstorm. It was midday, though you wouldn't know it by the light, or lack thereof. The sun barely rose here in the winter months, a pale orb that lurked behind the veil of endless gloom. "Callum!" The shout came from inside, muffled by the layers of insulation in the station walls. Callum turned, shivering against the cold, and trudged back inside. Inside the research station, the air was warmer but stifling. A faint metallic tang from the equipment lingered, mingling with the smell of sweat and coffee gone sour. The team, 6 of them in total, were crammed into the common area, their faces tight with tension. "We've picked up something on the seismograph," said Dr. Ilya Novak, the team's geophysicist. His accent was thick, his words clipped. He pointed to a trembling line on the screen. "Look at this. It's faint, but it's rhythmic, too regular to be natural." "Could it be tectonic activity?" Callum asked, leaning over the monitor. "Not in this region. The crust here is stable. Whatever this is—" Ilya hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "It's localized, a single source, about 3 kilometers to the east." Callum frowned. "A glacier collapse? Unlikely. It doesn't match the signature." The room fell silent. They all knew what this meant. Something unexplained. And out here, in the heart of the frozen wilderness, the unexplained was never a good thing. Later that evening, the team gathered around the dining table. The station's generator hummed in the background, a reminder of their dependence on technology to survive. The walls were covered in photos, maps, and charts, a chaotic collage of human curiosity. "We should check it out," said Anya Morales, the team's climatologist. She was young, eager, the kind of person who thrived on adventure. "Check what out?" countered Lars Eklund, the station's mechanic. He was broad-shouldered, with a face that always seemed to be scowling. "We don't even know what it is." "Exactly," Anya shot back. "Isn't that why we're here? To investigate anomalies?" Lars crossed his arms. "We're here to study climate patterns, not chase ghosts in the snow." "It's not ghosts," Ilya said sharply. "It's data, and data doesn't lie." Callum held up a hand, silencing the debate. "Enough. We'll send out a team tomorrow. Ilya, Anya, you're with me. Lars, you and Sophie stay here and monitor the equipment. Sound good?" There were murmurs of agreement, though Lars's scowl deepened. That night, Callum lay in his bunk, staring at the ceiling. The room was dark except for the faint green glow of the emergency exit sign. The hum of the station seemed louder in the stillness, a constant reminder of how fragile their little bubble of warmth was against the Arctic's unrelenting cold. Just as he was about to drift off, he heard it. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, a high, lilting melody that seemed to rise and fall like the tide. A child's voice. Callum sat up, his heart hammering in his chest. He strained to listen, but the sound was gone, replaced by the familiar howling of the wind. Shaking his head, he lay back down, telling himself it was just his imagination. But he didn't sleep. The next morning, the team geared up for their trek to the anomaly. Layers of thermal clothing, thick boots, gloves, and goggles turned them into faceless silhouettes, indistinguishable from one another. Callum led the way, with Ilya carrying the portable seismograph and Anya scanning the horizon with a GPS device. The journey was brutal. The wind clawed at them, and the snow underfoot was treacherous, hiding deep crevices that could swallow a person whole. The temperature hovered around -40, a cold so intense it burned. After an hour of trudging through the wasteland, they arrived at the coordinates. "This is it," Anya said, checking the GPS. The ground beneath their feet was a patch of ancient, undisturbed ice. The seismograph trembled in Ilya's hands, its needle bouncing in a steady rhythm. "Whatever's causing this is directly below us," he said. They began to dig. It took hours. Their tools clanged against the ice, echoing into the void. The sun was a dim glow on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Then Anya's shovel struck something solid. "Got something?" she called out, her voice muffled by her scarf. The others gathered around as she scraped away the remaining ice. Slowly, a shape emerged, a small figure, curled up as if sleeping. It was a child, perfectly preserved in the ice. The body was clad in old-fashioned clothing, its features delicate and serene. In its arms, it clutched a small, intricately carved doll. "Jesus," Ilya whispered, stepping back. Anya knelt down, brushing frost from the figure's face. "This can't be possible," she murmured. "The preservation, it's like it was frozen yesterday." "But how long has it been here?" Callum asked, his voice tight. "No way to tell without carbon dating," Ilya said, though his voice lacked conviction. As they stood there, the wind seemed to change. It grew softer, almost melodic. And then they heard it again, the singing. It was unmistakable now, a child's voice, high and clear, carrying a haunting melody that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. The sound didn't come from the wind. It came from the ice. "Let's get back to the station," Callum said sharply. They wrapped the frozen figure carefully in thermal blankets, securing it to the sled they'd brought. The doll, still clutched in the child's hands, seemed to glimmer faintly in the fading light. The singing followed them all the way back, a spectral lullaby that seemed to seep into their bones. By the time they returned to the station, night had fallen. The team was exhausted, their nerves frayed. They placed the frozen body in the storage room, locking the door behind them. Anya sat at the table, staring into her mug of coffee. "It doesn't make sense," she muttered. "How could something like that be out here? Who was she?" No one answered. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. Later, as Callum sat alone in his quarters, he thought he heard it again. The singing was softer this time, almost a whisper, and it was coming from inside the station. Callum sat alone in his quarters, his nerves frayed. The child's frozen body was locked in the storage room, but the singing hadn't stopped. It had softened, transforming into a whisper that seemed to come from within the station itself. Callum didn't sleep that night. The whispers moved through the walls like a breeze, faint but persistent, words just beyond the edge of comprehension. He sat on the edge of his bunk, gripping the edge of the mattress with white-knuckled hands, his breath fogging in the freezing air. The station wasn't supposed to get this cold. The heating system was designed to keep the living quarters a steady 65 degrees Fahrenheit, but now the air was sharp and biting, their insulated walls doing little to keep the creeping chill at bay. By the time the morning alarm chimed through the station, signaling the start of a new day, Callum felt as though he'd been awake for weeks. The team gathered in the common room, their faces pale and drawn. It wasn't just Callum who'd heard it. Each of them had spent the night haunted by the same eerie lullaby, a sound that didn't belong in this world. "It was everywhere," Lars said, his voice low. He sat at the table, his large hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Not just in my quarters, it was inside my head. Anya nodded, her hands trembling as she tried to sip her tea. Same here. It wasn't just singing either. I swear I heard words, whispers. What did they say? Callum asked. I don't know. It was like... She shook her head, her eyes darting toward the storage room, like they didn't want me to understand, just wanted me to listen. That's insane, Lars snapped, his tone sharper than usual. It's just the wind. We've been out here too long, that's all. Cabin fever. Cabin fever doesn't make you hear the same thing as everyone else, Ilya said, his voice tight with barely restrained fear. Callum held up a hand to silence them. Enough. Whatever's happening, we need to focus. Anya, Ilya, I want you to run tests on the body. See what you can find out. Lars, check the heating system. It's freezing in here, and we can't afford to lose temperature control. And what are you going to do? Lars asked, his tone accusatory. I'll monitor the situation, Callum said, though he didn't elaborate. The storage room was colder than the rest of the station, the temperature plummeting the moment they stepped inside. Anya and Ilya worked in silence, their breaths visible in the frosty air. The body lay on the examination table, still wrapped in the thermal blankets. Anya hesitated before pulling them back, revealing the small figure beneath. The child's face was serene, its eyes closed as though in peaceful slumber. Frost clung to the delicate features, and the doll, still clutched tightly in the child's hands, seemed oddly pristine, its wooden surface untouched by time. This isn't natural, Anya murmured, running her gloved fingers along the surface of the ice that encased the child's lower body. Look at this. No frost damage, no signs of decay. It's like it's been preserved. Not preserved, Ilya said, his voice hollow. Frozen. There's a difference. What do you mean? Ilya didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the seismograph readings on his tablet, the rhythmic tremors continuing to pulse beneath the station. It's like the ice itself is alive, he said finally. Meanwhile, Lars was in the generator room, cursing under his breath. The heating system was failing, though he couldn't figure out why. The generator was functioning normally, the fuel supply untouched, but the vents were blowing icy air instead of warmth. Come on, you piece of junk, he muttered, wrenching open the vent panel. As he worked, he became aware of a faint sound, a high, lilting hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. He froze, his heart pounding. Hello? He called out, his voice echoing in the cramped space. No response. Shaking his head, Lars turned back to the panel, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a hum anymore, it was singing, a child's voice, clear and haunting. Lars spun around, his flashlight cutting through the shadows. Who's there? The singing stopped, and then, just for a moment, he saw something, a flicker of movement in the corner of his vision, a small figure darting past the edge of the light. Lars staggered back, his breath catching in his throat. This isn't real, he whispered. It's not real. But the doll clutched in the child's hands, the same doll they'd pulled from the ice, was lying on the floor in front of him. By the time Lars returned to the common room, his face was pale and his hands were shaking. What happened? Callum asked, his concern deepening. I saw her, Lars said, his voice barely audible. The girl, she's not in the storage room anymore. That's impossible, Anya said, but her voice wavered. I know what I saw, Lars snapped, and she left this. He held up the doll, its carved features glinting faintly in the dim light. The room fell silent, the air thick with dread. That night, the whispers turned into voices. They spoke in a language none of them understood, but their intent was clear. The voices were angry, mournful, and filled with a sorrow so deep it clawed at their very souls. Callum sat at the table, staring at the doll Lars had placed there. Its black button eyes seemed to watch him. Its stitched mouth curved in a knowing smile. The whispers grew louder, surrounding him, and then, as if from a great distance, he heard his own name. Callum. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The room was empty, the others asleep, or pretending to be. "Who's there?" he demanded. The voices didn't answer, but the doll's smile seemed to widen. The team was unraveling under the weight of the voices and the impossible occurrences. Lars had seen the frozen child outside the storage room, leaving the doll as a chilling marker. Callum, alone in the common room, heard his name whispered by unseen forces as the doll's stitched smile seemed to grow wider in the dim light. The cold was everywhere now, not just in the air, but in their thoughts, their bones. It settled deep inside, numbing more than flesh, making them feel brittle and ready to crack. Callum sat at the table long after the whispers faded, the doll's black button eyes fixed on him. He wanted to toss it into the furnace, to watch it burn, but something held him back. It wasn't fear. No, it was something deeper, an irrational, unshakable certainty that destroying the doll would only make things worse. The others wouldn't believe him if he said that out loud. Maybe he didn't believe it himself, but he couldn't shake the feeling. By the time the others emerged from their quarters, drawn by the faint gray light of dawn filtering through the frost-covered windows, Callum was still sitting there, staring at the doll. "Did you sleep at all?" Anya asked, her voice soft but strained. Callum shook his head. "We need to figure out what's happening before it's too late." Anya looked at the doll and quickly turned away. "You're not the only one who heard things." "Voices?" Callum asked. She nodded. "Not just voices. I saw her." "Her?" Anya hesitated, then spoke in a rush. "The girl. She was standing in my room. I thought I was dreaming, but she was there. I swear it." "What did she do?" "She didn't do anything. Just stood there, holding that doll. And then she was gone." Lars walked in, his expression grim. "It's not just us. The whole station's wrong. The vents are blowing cold air, and the walls, they're sweating." "Sweating?" Callum frowned. "Condensation. But it's too cold for that to happen naturally. Something's messing with the environment." Before Callum could respond, Ilya stormed into the room, his face pale and drawn. "The body," he said, his voice trembling. "It's gone." They gathered in the storage room, the air colder than ever. The thermal blankets lay discarded on the floor, and the examination table was empty. "No footprints," Lars said, scanning the icy floor. "That doesn't make sense," Anya whispered. "None of this makes sense," Callum snapped, his frustration boiling over. The seismograph, still stationed in the corner, let out a sudden, sharp beep. Ilya rushed to the device, his hands trembling as he examined the readings. "The tremors," he said. "They're stronger now, and they're moving." "Moving?" Callum echoed. "They're coming from below us, and they're getting closer." The team reconvened in the common room, the tension palpable. Callum paced while the others sat silently, their eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. "We need to figure this out," Callum said. "Whatever's happening, it's connected to that body, and the doll." "Burn it," Lars said suddenly. "What?" "The doll," Lars repeated. "Burn it. If this thing is causing all this, we get rid of it." "No," Anya said, her voice sharp. Everyone turned to her. Why not? Lars demanded. Because I think it's protecting us. Lars let out a bitter laugh. Protecting us? Are you out of your mind? Have you looked around? This place is falling apart, and you think that thing is helping us? I don't know, Anya admitted, but I feel it. If we destroy it, whatever's out there will come for us. The room fell silent. That night, the whispers returned. They were louder now, clearer. Callum sat in his quarters, his back pressed against the wall, listening as the voices circled him. Callum, come to us. The words were soft, almost kind, but they carried a weight that made his chest tighten. You've seen her. Now see us. His hand shook as he gripped the edge of his cot. The doll was on the floor beside him, its black button eyes glinting faintly in the dim light. He didn't remember bringing it to his room. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Below, come below. The next morning, the tremors were stronger. The entire station seemed to shudder as if something vast and ancient was stirring beneath the ice. We have to leave, Lars said, his voice edged with panic. Get to the snowmobiles and head back to the mainland. And go where? Ilya countered. You think whatever this is won't follow us? It's not following us now, Lars shot back. It's here, in the ice. If we leave, we might have a chance. Enough, Callum shouted, silencing them. No one's going anywhere until we figure this out. Figure what out? Lars demanded. That we're all going to die out here? Before Callum could respond, the lights flickered. The hum of the generator faltered, then resumed, but the room felt darker, colder, and then they heard it, the singing. It echoed through the station, high and lilting, the same haunting melody that had followed them back from the dig site. But this time it wasn't faint. It was everywhere. They followed the sound to the storage room. The door creaked open, revealing the empty examination table. The singing grew louder as they stepped inside, filling their ears, their minds. And then the floor cracked. It wasn't a small crack, it was a deep, jagged fissure that split the ice beneath their feet. They scrambled back as the fissure widened, revealing a dark chasm that seemed to stretch into infinity. The singing stopped, and then something moved in the darkness below. A shadow, vast and shapeless, began to rise. The ice beneath the research station had split open, revealing a deep, yawning chasm. From the abyss rose a shadow, a vast, formless thing that seemed to draw the dim light out of the room. The team stood frozen in terror as the singing stopped, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. The thing that rose from the fissure wasn't solid, not in any way their minds could comprehend. It was a mass of shifting shadows, tendrils writhing like smoke in a windless room. Its edges seemed to shimmer, bending the air around it. Callum felt his knees weaken. The others stood motionless, their breaths shallow and rapid. The air itself seemed heavier, pressing down on them, making their thoughts sluggish. And then, without warning, the singing returned. But it wasn't the sweet, haunting melody they'd heard before. This was different, fractured and dissonant, a cacophony of childlike voices that scraped against their minds. You called us. The voice wasn't a sound so much as a presence, vibrating through their bones, their teeth. It came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the room, the station, the very ice beneath their feet. Callum tried to speak, but his throat was dry. His voice caught somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The shadow shifted, coalescing into something vaguely humanoid, though its form flickered and twisted, refusing to settle. 2 pinpricks of pale light appeared where eyes should have been, staring down at them with an intensity that made Callum's skin crawl. "You disturbed the quiet." Anya was the first to break the silence. "We didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice trembling. "We didn't know." The thing tilted its head, the movement unnatural, as if it were mimicking a gesture it didn't fully understand. "You knew. You heard the song. You followed." "No," Lars said, stepping forward despite the shaking in his legs. "We didn't follow anything. We were doing our jobs, that's all. This isn't our fault." The pale lights shifted, focusing on him. Lars froze, his defiance evaporating under the creature's gaze. "The ice remembers. The ice keeps. You took what was not yours." The doll. The thought struck Callum like a thunderclap. The doll was the key, the thing they should never have touched. The child's body had been a warning, a sentinel guarding something far older and far more dangerous. He looked down at the doll still clutched in his hands. Its button eyes seemed to glint with malice, the stitched smile mocking him. "Is this what you want?" Callum asked, his voice hoarse. He held the doll up, his hand shaking. The creature didn't respond, but the shadows around it seemed to ripple, a low guttural hum vibrating through the air. The station began to tremble. The fissure widened, and icy wind howled up from the depths, carrying with it a chorus of voices, screams, laughter, and sobbing, all blending into an unholy symphony. "We need to leave," Lars shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Now." "We can't leave," Anya snapped. "Look around you. There's no way out." Ilya clutched his tablet, his eyes glued to the seismic readings. "It's spreading," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The tremors. They're everywhere now. The whole ice shelf is destabilizing." "What does that mean?" Lars demanded. "It means," Ilya said, his face pale, "that if we don't stop this, the entire station and everything around it is going to collapse into the sea." The creature's shadowy form began to rise higher, its tendrils stretching toward the walls, the ceiling, wrapping around the room like living smoke. The voices grew louder, more insistent, each word dripping with malice. "Return what you have taken." Callum's grip on the doll tightened. He felt its weight, far heavier than it should have been, as though the thing in his hands was alive, pulsing with the same dark energy that filled the room. "What do you want?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Just tell us, and we'll do it." The pale lights fixed on him again. "You cannot undo what is done, but you will pay." The lights in the station flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed them, thick and suffocating. The only illumination came from the pale glow of the creature's eyes and the faint, otherworldly light emanating from the fissure. And then the shadows moved. One of the tendrils lashed out, striking Lars with a force that sent him crashing into the wall. He let out a strangled cry as the shadow wrapped around him, lifting him off the ground. "No!" Anya screamed, rushing forward, but another tendril blocked her path, slamming her back. Lars struggled, his face contorted with terror. "Help me!" he choked out, but the shadow was relentless, pulling him toward the fissure. "Let him go!" Callum shouted, his voice breaking. He lunged forward, swinging the doll like a weapon, but the shadow knocked him aside as if he were nothing more than a fly. Lars let out one final desperate scream before the shadow dragged him into the abyss. And then he was gone. The remaining 3 huddled together, their breaths ragged, their minds reeling. "What do we do?" Anya whispered, tears streaming down her face. Callum looked at the doll, its mocking smile now unbearable. "We give it back," he said. "How?" Ilya asked, his voice hollow. "It's too late. You heard it. It said we can't undo this." "We have to try," Callum said. He stood, clutching the doll tightly. "If we don't, we're all dead." Anya and Ilya hesitated, then nodded, their fear overridden by desperation. They made their way toward the fissure, the air growing colder with each step. The creature's tendrils writhed, but it didn't attack, its pale eyes watching them intently. Callum stood at the edge of the chasm, the abyss yawning before him. The doll felt impossibly heavy now, as if it were resisting him. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. And then he threw the doll into the darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the singing stopped. The shadows recoiled, the creature's form flickering as if caught in a violent wind. The station trembled, the fissure beginning to close, the air filled with an ear-splitting roar. Callum, Anya, and Ilya scrambled back, watching as the creature dissolved, its pale eyes fading into nothingness. But the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It was hollow, a vacuum that seemed to swallow even their thoughts. The fissure was gone, the shadows were gone, but so was Lars, and deep beneath the ice, far below where their instruments could reach, the singing began again. The fissure closed, the shadowy creature dissolved into nothingness, and the haunting singing had ceased. For now, Callum, Anya, and Ilya were left shaken, the station deathly silent. Lars was gone, dragged into the abyss, and though the immediate threat appeared to have passed, a hollow tension hung in the frozen air. Far below the ice, the faint echoes of the lullaby began again. The three survivors sat in the common room, their faces drawn and pale. The station creaked and groaned around them, the sounds of its structure settling now, amplified in the absence of the chaos that had filled the past few days. Anya broke the silence. Her voice was soft, brittle, like a single touch could shatter her. "It's not over." Callum looked up from his hands, which were red and raw from gripping the doll before he'd hurled it into the fissure. "What do you mean?" "You heard it," she said, her eyes hollow. "The singing. It's still there. We didn't stop it, Callum. We just pushed it back." Ilya shook his head, his expression a mix of exhaustion and denial. "The fissure is gone. The creature is gone. We gave it what it wanted." Anya turned to him, her voice sharp. "Did we? Or did we just give it enough to hold it off? Enough to let it regroup, to wait for the next time someone disturbs it?" Neither of them had an answer. Callum stood and paced the room, his boots scraping against the frost-covered floor. "We can't just sit here," he said. "If this thing isn't gone, then we need to find out what it is, why it's here, what it wants." "You're talking about going back out there?" Ilya asked incredulously. Callum nodded. "We've already opened the door. If we don't figure out how to close it for good, this won't stop. And not just here. Whatever's under the ice, it's ancient, it's powerful. If it gets out..." He trailed off, but they all understood the unspoken horror of what he meant. Anya took a deep breath. "We'll need to start with the files, the records from the dig site. Maybe there's something we missed." Ilya hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but if we don't find anything, we get out of here. Agreed?" Callum didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said he wasn't planning to leave until he had answers. The station's small archive room was cramped and cold, the walls lined with metal shelves holding decades of research and reports. They sifted through old documents, digging for anything that might hint at the origins of the child's body, the doll, or the shadowy entity they had awakened. Anya pulled a file labeled Ice Core Samples, 1993. "This might be something," she said, flipping through the pages. "What is it?" Callum asked, leaning over her shoulder. Back in the 90s, another team drilled core samples from this same area. They recorded unusual anomalies, air bubbles with high concentrations of gases that don't match anything in the atmosphere today. They also mentioned strange sounds picked up on their equipment. Sounds like what we've been hearing? Maybe. They didn't describe it in detail, but they stopped the project abruptly. The report just says, "Unexplained phenomena rendered the site unsafe." "Why wasn't this flagged before?" Callum demanded. "Because no one wanted to believe it," Ilya muttered from across the room. He held up another report, this one dated even earlier. "This place has a history. There were expeditions here as far back as the 1940s. All of them ended with unexplained incidents, disappearances, equipment failures, strange weather patterns, and every time the area was abandoned for decades before someone else decided to try again." As they pieced together the fragmented history of the site, a pattern began to emerge. Every expedition that had ventured too deep into the ice had encountered something, a presence, a force that defied explanation. "It's like it's guarding something," Anya said, her voice tinged with dread. "Something it doesn't want us to find." "Or something it doesn't want us to release," Callum added grimly. The tremors started again that night. They were faint at first, barely perceptible, but they grew stronger as the hours passed. By midnight, the entire station was shuddering, the walls groaning under the strain. The three of them gathered in the common room, their faces pale and drawn. "It's happening again," Anya said. Callum nodded. "We didn't stop it. We just delayed it." "What do we do?" Ilya asked, his voice cracking. "We can't fight this thing. It's not human. It's not even real." "It's real," Callum said. "We've seen what it can do, and if we don't stop it, it'll keep growing, keep spreading. We have to go back." "Back where?" Ilya demanded. "The fissure is gone." "Not the fissure," Callum said. "The source. Whatever's calling to us from under the ice. That's where we'll find our answers." The final trek across the frozen expanse was silent, the only sound the crunch of their boots on the snow. The storm had subsided, leaving the landscape eerily still. They reached the original dig site just as the tremors intensified. The ice beneath their feet cracked and groaned, and the air was filled with a low, humming vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. The fissure reopened before them, wider this time, the darkness within deeper and more foreboding. "This is madness," Ilya muttered, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Stay close," Callum said. "If we're going to do this, we do it together." They descended into the chasm, their headlamps casting feeble beams of light into the oppressive darkness. The air grew colder with each step, their breaths freezing into crystals that hung in the air. The singing began again, soft at first, but growing louder as they ventured deeper. It wasn't just one voice now, it was many, a chorus of children's laughter and weeping that echoed off the icy walls. At the bottom of the chasm, they found it. The ice gave way to a cavern, its walls shimmering with an unnatural light. At its center stood a massive ancient structure, half buried in the ice. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, organic and mechanical, as if grown rather than built. And at its base, encased in a column of ice, was the child. Her eyes were open now, glowing with the same pale light as the creature they had encountered before. The doll was in her hands once more, its stitched smile wider than ever. "You have come," the voices whispered, reverberating through the cavern. "What is this?" Anya whispered, her voice barely audible. "The beginning," Callum said, his voice trembling. The ice began to crack around them, the cavern trembling as the voices grew louder. Callum stepped forward, his heart pounding. "What do you want?" he shouted into the void. The child's glowing eyes locked onto his. The voices answered in unison, "To be free." And then the ice shattered.